All right. Here are some further interesting points about the Celtic creation myth. Some of the most interesting details to me that we can point to follow some of these threads and really see how uncanny this parallel is. And to begin with, I have to give the disclaimer that this is not every piece of evidence for the Celtic creation myth. That would be impossible to give in a YouTube video. So it goes without saying that these are short summaries to get people started on the question so they can see the most basic skeleton of the easiest starting points to grasp, such as the meanings of the core individuals' names and how they generally parallel the same myth structures elsewhere. I have given much more detailed argumentation and proofs elsewhere, with going really into the details where it gets really fascinating in my book in particular, as well as in extended summary videos on my channel. Still, the points that we can look at on here are fascinating. But first, a principle needs to be established, which is that if you're actually in good faith trying to identify something, you're always doing comparison. You have to do comparison if you are in good faith. That means if you're doing a taxonomy of something, identifying something, and trying to see how it is categorized, it is always done by comparison. Say, for example, you find a new bird. You want to ask, is this bird a duck? What you would first do, of course, is to compare it to what we know about other ducks. This would be a body of knowledge about ducks that has been established, that has been collected by looking at all other ducks and finding their shared features. Finally, establishing the taxonomy, establishing the category of duck. You then would compare the new bird that you found to that category, to all of those other ducks in that category, to then make a good faith conclusion about, is this a duck or not? You can't avoid doing comparison if you're actually asking the question, is this such and such thing? You have to compare to that category. Now, once you are asking a question which requires comparative mythology, such as, is this a creation myth? Once you are asking that question and actually asking it, you then have to do the comparative mythology thoroughly. Now, once you are involved in asking this question in earnest and being serious about asking, is there a Celtic creation myth? Is this particular text a Celtic creation myth? You are already involving yourself in comparative mythology. It is not avoidable. And what oftentimes happens is that it is then just done superficially. It is just done poorly. So you can't avoid doing comparative mythology, but you can do it poorly. You can simply do it lazily or in a half measure kind of way, which is what often happens, because self-labeling is inherently unreliable. It does not actually tell us the specific traits that are of interest to make a categorization accurately. Self-referring labels are inherently unreliable. And this is just as true, if not more so, for texts. Texts are known as inherently unreliable in different ways. Narrators can be unreliable. What a text says about itself, how a text categorizes itself outwardly, does not tell us the whole story of what that text is actually doing and how it should be categorized by its actual traits and details. To begin with, one of the most important aspects of this parallel and its argument is that we have a version in the Irish texts, the Book of Invasions, and another version in the Welsh text, Branwen, daughter of Llŷr. And that when you put these side by side, they reinforce the argument. If you have two versions, you can see how they align and then how they clarify one another. And they are like two legs on a table supporting one another, giving strength to the argument, of course. They are not taken on their own. In itself, the Irish material does not prove anything. It is a comparative argument. Therefore, the points at which Branwen, daughter of Llŷr, and the Book of Invasions, Sons of Meal story, the points at which they align and are similar nearly to being identical, at those points, we can see reinforcement of the fact that they are two parts of this Celtic creation myth story, two versions, one version preserving some details, the other preserving others. And when you see them together, they clarify the fuller picture of what's going on. So the core first thing where they align, of course, is that we have four brothers in both cases, with three of them being these main attackers who are the Rudra type. The fourth brother is this Yama type in the argumentation that I've laid out. But that core starting point is that we have the Rudra type with these three brothers, Averfin, Averjin, and Erevan, and then Efnisian, Nisian, and Manawydan. And that leaves the fourth brother, of course, in both cases. Averdown in the Book of Invasions dies before reaching the shore, and Bendigade Bran in the Welsh story of Branwen, of course. Averdown dies approaching Ireland. His ship shipwrecks, and Bran dies at the end of the battle that happens, and before they return to their own island. Now, what's interesting there, other than the fact that they both are one of the prominent deaths, and other than that they have this death-like symbolism, the severed head, is that we have a similar scene in the deaths of both of them, where each of them specifically request that their brothers carry their body or head back to a certain other island from where they are and place it there as something that is symbolizing their presence. Despite those differences that are clear and obvious, the severed head versus just the body, despite those, it's a very similar scene nonetheless. So if we look, for example, at the death of Aver Down. So we have the Din Shenachas of Tech Dwin, and forgive my pronunciation. It says, after they had cursed down, there came forthwith an ague into the ship. Said Averhin, Down will die, said he, and it were not lucky for us to keep his body, lest we catch the disease. For if Down be brought ashore, the disease will remain in Erin forever. Said Down, let my body be carried to one of the islands, said he, and my people will lay a blessing on me forever. Then, through the incantations of the Druids, a storm came upon them, and the ship wherein Down was foundered. Let his body be carried to yonder high rock, says Avergin. His folk shall come to this spot. So hence it is called Tech Dwin, and for this cause, according to the heathen, the souls of sinners visit Tech Dwin before they go to hell, and give their blessing, ere they go, to the soul of Down. But as for the righteous soul of a penitent, it beholds the place from afar, and is not borne astray. Okay, so he requests specifically, he says, let my body be carried to one of the islands, and my people will lay a blessing on me forever, and they do so. In the case of Bran, we have this. So this is the conclusion of the war. It says, and Bendigade Vran himself was wounded in the foot with a poisoned dart. Interestingly, we have the poisoned dart, and we have an ague, a sort of illness or plague-like thing, which afflicts Aver Down. We have a poisoned dart afflicting Bran. And Bendigade Vran commanded them that they should cut off his head. Quote, and take you my head, said he, and bear it even unto the White Mount in London, and bury it there, with the face towards France. And a long time will you be upon the road. In Harlech you will be feasting 7 years, the birds of Rhiannon singing unto you the while. And all that time the head will be to you as pleasant company as it ever was when on my body, etc. And of course, he then requests that after that, there you may no longer tarry, set forth then to London to bury the head, and go straight forward. So they cut off his head, and these 7 went forward therewith. And they then do so. They go to this place, this island, and they bear the head. And at this island, they have a time of feasting, of course, and then they eventually take Bran's head to London as he requested. So, yeah, it's a very similar pathway, except in the Welsh version, there's this additional endpoint where they bring him to London itself, and there are clear differences, of course. I'm not saying there are not, but you can see the similarity. Don says, let my body be carried to one of the islands, and my people will lay a blessing on me forever, and they do so, and he is afflicted with an ague. Bran is afflicted with a poisoned dart, and says, he commanded them that they should cut off his head, and take you my head, and bear it even unto the White Mount in London, and bury it there, etc. And, okay, so this is not all, though, because the islands that both of them go to with either the body of Down or the head of Bran, very conspicuously, are at the southwest coast of the island, on this sort of remote, semi-remote point, specifically off the southwest coast. Now, this is crucial because this is one of the key points that scholars such as Bruce Lincoln and even John Kerry have pointed to when arguing for the parallel between Averdown and Yama, because Yama's loka is also situated in the same direction. They point to the same directionality of Yama's loka. Now, look specifically at where the two islands are. The island that they take Averdown to, off the coast of Ireland, and the island that they take Bran to, where he is feasted as the sacred head, off the coast of Wales. So, first of all, this is called Dursey Island, off the coast of Ireland. And if you look here at the red dot on Ireland, we have Dursey Island. And Dursey Island is generally identified with this mythical place of Tech Dwyn, House of Down, where they take his body in the story. That there is a certain rock that's part of this island, and that rock is identified with Tech Dwyn. But this is the location, and we can see that it is clearly this far point in the southwest, right off the coast, and it is this sort of this sort of barren-looking rock island place there. Now, if we then look right away at the island where they take Bran, we'll see that it is equivalently located in relation to Wales. So if we can see that this is Wales here, and the little flag, the little blue flag dot off the coast in the southwest there, is this island known as Grassholm, and in the story of Bran and Branwen, it's referred to as Gwales, and forgive my pronunciation. But yes, it is this place. It is identified with this Isle of Grassholm today, and it is specifically this southwestern remote point. It's essentially the most remote isle there, off to the west of the southerly peninsula there, and that is where they take Bran's head. Once again, this is the direction identified with where Yama has his afterlife, Lord of the Dead, loka, in the Vedic material, and that's one of the strong points that comparative scholars have used before to connect Averdown and down to Yama himself. We then have it right there, an extremely strong, extremely uncanny connection between Averdown and Bran. They both have some kind of affliction that's like a poison or an ague. Those are similar but different things. They are then going to die, and right then they request that their men carry their body or head to this isle that is specifically off the southwest coast. In the story of Bran, the ultimate location where he is asked to be taken is back to London, but this can be understood as a variation specific to that tradition, and that still makes a strong parallel. So if there is any question that Averdown should parallel Bran, that should be a strong enough parallel where you can see the definite plausibility, the seriousness of the parallel between them. I've also pointed out elsewhere a figure named Down Bow, who is a speaking severed head in other lore, and I've further gone into how Diarmid, who has as his surname a surname that seems to connect him to Down, Diarmid O'Jivnia, there is even a version of his name where he's called Down Diarmid, with D-O-N-N being like his epithet attached to him. Diarmid has a very, very specific and uncanny mythic parallel to the Ironic Yima, that is the cognate of Yama. So I go into this in a different video. Go watch my Garden of Eden stream discussing this god type, the Yama god type, the Yima, and the Diarmid, also known as Down Diarmid. So taken together, it becomes very convincing that this is the best comparative parallel for Averdown, and therefore that this is once again the same mythos seen in Bran himself. He then asks his men to carry him to this southwesterly isle specifically, and at that isle, it is a sort of otherworld in both instances. It's very clearly a time out of time otherworld that's like a land of the dead, even in the story of Bran, where he is a severed head at this feast. That is an image that could be an image of some kind of gateway land of the dead, very easily, where you go to feast with Bran, who is the Lord of the Dead in a severed head role. Same thing is more explicit in the story of Down. Now, if you will look at the instances of the texts in the Rig Veda describing Yama and his location, his land of the dead, in the Rig Veda itself, we can see even further the similarities. So first we have, in the tree, clothed with goodly leaves, where Yama drinketh with the gods, the father, master of the house, tendeth with love our ancient sires. So our ancient sires are the Petries, the fathers, the archetypal fathers who are like our ancestors, who are there with Yama. And this is sort of this image of the land of the dead. And specifically, Yama is drinking with the gods there, but he is depicted in this mode of drinking, which implies a kind of feasting, drinking, very similar thing. Like if you were to have this in a Germanic or Celtic context, you'd go to a mead hall and drink, and that would be this image of feasting / drinking. We then have, go forth, upon the ancient pathways, whereon our sires, again, those are our fathers, our ancestors, of old have gone before us. Mere shalt thou look on both the kings enjoying their sacred food, God Varuna and Yama. So they are enjoying sacred food, they are feasting. And this is where our fathers have gone before us. This is the land of the dead. Meet Yama, meet the fathers. Those are the deceased ancestors. Meet the merit of free or ordered acts in highest heaven. Leave sin and evil, seek anew thy dwelling, and bright with glory wear another body. Go hence, depart ye, fly in all directions. This place for him the fathers have provided. Yama bestows on him a place to rest in, adorned with days and beams of light and waters. Run and outspeed the two dogs, Sarama's offspring, brindled, four-eyed, upon thy happy pathway. Draw nigh then to the gracious-minded fathers, where they rejoice in company with Yama. And those two dogs of thine, Yama the watchers, four-eyed, who look on men and guard the pathway. So it's very clearly this similar depiction of a place of feasting and drinking with Yama, who's the Lord of the Dead. And it has these elements of the Lord of the Dead, which are these dogs that actually bring this dangerous, fearful element that you have to kind of be aware and careful in this place. But at the same time, it is a place of rest provided by Yama. It is where the sires have gone before. You are somehow resting, separated now from sin and evil. These are like the cares of the world that you're separated from in the Bran story. You are away from sin and evil, the cares of the world, in this placid kind of feasting depiction with Yama, a place of rest, adorned with days and beams of lights and waters, etc. But there is this lurking danger there, and there's no guarantee here that this place lasts eternally either. So, of course, the Vedic conception and the Celtic conception of how and if you're reincarnated after such a place, whether you do stay there forever or not, those can be completely different. And still, these pictures can come from an original shared root where it's developed in their own unique ways in different societies. We have this place of feasting with Yama and with the sires, but this sort of caution that you have to exercise while you're there as well. And again, the Ironic Yima is cut apart very explicitly at the end of his story, Yima, aka Jamshid, and the Norse Mimir, the severed head god of wisdom and the well, has been shown by Victor Rydberg to be the strongest parallel for Yama. And he's the severed head god, just like Bran is, a speaking severed head, who after his head is severed, he still speaks. And he's associated with this grove, this placid grove that protects humans for a temporary time while this cataclysmic winter goes on. This protective locale that's an other world, but also aligned with death and the imagery of the severed head, etc. So thus, on the question of Diarmid, we have Diarmid, who also becomes a speaking corpse, who when he dies, his dead body also speaks. His name is Don Diarmid, just like the god Down or Dawn. When you put these things together, it is actually extremely well supported that Eivor Down and even Bran are the likely equivalents of Yama, and that they actually do come from a shared mythic root, and that their stories originated from that shared root, and therefore that gives the impetus to the sorts of things they do. Those lie at the bedrock of these stories. And please see my live stream on Diarmid and Yama for more information on this topic, where we go much more thoroughly into the proofs regarding Diarmid and also Down. So the next point that is extremely interesting is that not only does Efnisien perform a role uncannily fitting with this Vedic role of Vastoshpati, the defender of the house, when Efnisien goes into the special giant house and kills all of the men who are lurking in there with his bare hands, therefore cleansing the house as Vastoshpati does and as Mahandev does in the Kalash myth. So not only does he seem to step into this exact role that we see in the other Indo-European creation myths, not only that, but as I showed on the screen in my last video, it is actually Vastoshpati who is the specific aspect or epithet of Rudra that is the lord of poetry and art. Not only that, but Efnisien speaks lines of poetry as he is doing this action, killing the men and cleansing the house. He speaks lines of poetry, and as I understand it, they are actually the first lines of poetry spoken in the 4 branches of the Mabinogi. And he is also only one of 2 figures in the Mabinogi who do speak lines of poetry out, thus making him the first and one of the only prominent poets in the Mabinogi. Well, not only this, but it is Vastoshpati, the cleanser of the house in this moment of the Vedic creation myth, who is the lord of poetry and of arts, that at this moment of cleansing the house that he does, he is actually establishing the archetype of art and of poetry specifically. And I showed this in text on the screen in my last video, but I find this so incredibly fascinating that I want to show this explanation specifically from Stella Kramersh's book, The Presence of Shiva, where she points out that it is this moment where Rudra turns into Vastoshpati, that is where Vastoshpati appears as the lord of art and of poetry and establishes the archetype of poetry in that moment. So let me just pull that up. So here, as she says, Lord of the sight, Vastu, the ordered field of power and its numinous guardian Rudra, the wild god, arose as Vastoshpati, guardian of the order of the cosmos and of the house built by man. It is Rudra who is skilled in art, the best of all artists, and the originator of all arts. See Mahabharata 12, Appendix 1, number 28, line 310. Because he grants an abode to the world and protects it, therefore he is called Vastoshpati. He is the lord of the dwelling. In its plan and orientation, the house built by man conforms with the laws of the cosmos. It has for its model the house of the cosmos, the house of Varuna. In the shape of a fierce fiery star, Vastoshpati, the hound of heaven, is its guardian. And then even more specifically to poetry, Stella Kramersh says, in this transmutation, the main actor, whose name is withheld because his action and its effect on his victim fully identify him, arises not as fire, not as wild archer, but as Vastoshpati, guardian of the dwelling and guardian of sacred order, Vratapa. In this shape, he emerges from the poem of magic power, the Brahman. Poetry in the sacred order of its meters is his domain. Therein, the fire of the wild archer sustains the form. Vastoshpati, created by the gods, the celestial intelligence, is the guardian of his domain, the world of sacred order, a rhythmic structure that is art, a cosmos. These are Vastu, the house that he guards. Thus, his world comes about. The double meaning of the word Raudra is intentional. The poem is about Rudra, the wild, formidable god, and it is itself a fiercely wild creation, charged with many meanings. Unquote. And so we can see, because the house itself is formed, is the archetype essentially of cosmic order, that is the world. Therefore, Vastoshpati arises here as the guardian of that order, and that order is formed from the sacred poetry of divinity, and it also then represents the archetype of all poetry and all art in the world. Poetry in the sacred order of its meters is his domain, Vastoshpati's domain. Therefore, it is incredibly, incredibly uncanny and beyond coincidence that Efnisien, in the very moment he is cleansing the house, he speaks the first lines of spoken poetry within the Mabinogi itself. And it is along with all these other specific events that I've described as belonging to the category of creation myth motifs. So along with identifying that Eru is the earth goddess and that therefore her husbands are very plausibly to be the usual husbands of the earth goddess, along with identifying Eru and that her marriage is destroyed just as the earth and sky marriage always is, divided or ended, the key to this whole creation myth is actually identifying the divider. Who is this violent god who does the division, who performs the creation myth in that sense? Because in my description of the creation myth in the other video, of course, I was giving a very cursory summary of the main contours so that people can understand that there likely is something here that you need to look more closely at. But in reality, I've given, 6-10 hours worth of content. I've written tens or hundreds of pages worth of argumentation, proving specifically that it is Finn or Aver Finn, who is the Rudra type god. So there is an extremely large amount of evidence backing that point up. It is just something I mentioned in passing, but there is an extreme amount of evidence backing the point up that it is indeed Finn, or Eivor Finn, who is the Rudra-type god, the equivalent of Rudra and the equivalent of Odin in Celtic mythology. And that is what confirms that when this Rudra does a attack very similar to the Rudra in the Vedas, that it is by far the most supported conclusion to say that this is from the same root as that Rudra attack in the Vedas. So if you don't establish specifically who Finn is and who the other figures are, then yeah, it's not going to appear a strong argument. If, however, you extensively establish that, then the conclusion follows as the most careful one that you can make. So that establishing of Finn as definitely the Rudra type and equivalent is indispensable for the further proving of this creation myth. Now, a very brief and cursory summary of some of those points that show this to be the case are that, first of all, Finn, just like Gwion Bach, has this food of knowledge myth, where he is the one to eat this food of knowledge or taste a certain food of knowledge. And from that single taste, he gains all of the knowledge in the world, and that food can no longer be eaten by another, and that there is a sort of rival to him to gain this food in every case. And that once he eats it, he becomes the sort of representative of all knowledge and archetype for the seer. All of this. Well, this exists in Indian mythology connected to Shiva. In the case of Shiva, it is Shiva giving this food to his son or sons. But it is made explicit in this tradition that those sons are emanations and continuations of Shiva himself, so that they are Shiva, but their names are Ganesha and Kartikeya, well-known deities themselves, but they are established as continuations of Shiva himself in his sons. We can see this in the story called the story of the fruit of knowledge in the Indian tradition. So the Indian version of this story is that Shiva and his wife Parvati make a contest for their two sons for who will win the fruit of knowledge, which is called the Jnanam Palam. Jnanam Palam. And this means fruit of knowledge. So the legend goes that the sage Narada once visited Shiva at his abode. Shiva chose to present the divine fruit to one of his two sons, Murugan, that is Kartikeya, or Ganesha, and he set forth a contest. The first one able to circle the world thrice would be awarded the prize. Murugan, who interpreted the instruction literally, instantly mounted his peacock and started his journey. Ganesha, whose own mount was a mouse, interpreted this instruction metaphysically and proclaimed his belief that the world in fact was embodied by his parents, Shiva and Parvati. He proceeded to circumambulate them thrice. Pleased with his wisdom, the Jnanam Palam was awarded to Ganesha. When Murugan returned, he was furious that his brother had won the fruit, believing that the latter had resorted to trickery. He renounced his grandeur and exalted position at Kailash and retired to the hills of Palani as a hermit, where it became one of his 6 sacred abodes. Shiva and Parvati are believed to have traveled to Palani to urge him to return. They attempted to pacify him, remarking that Murugan himself was the divine fruit. Popular etymology holds that the origin of the town, Palani, is a contraction of Tamil from this aforementioned statement. So as we can see here, as per Kanda Purana, the sage Narada, when he visited, presented this fruit of knowledge. The fruit is a mango. Shiva expressed his intention of dividing the fruit between his two sons at first, Ganesha and Kartikeya. But Narada counseled that the fruit could not be divided. So this is a key point here. The fruit can only go to one son. That is exactly the same, for example, as with Gwion Bach and the son of Ceridwen. When they are both there at the cauldron of knowledge, when the drops fall on Gwion Bach's finger and he tastes them, that is the last of the efficacy of the liquid. It can only go to one person, then it has used up its efficacy, and the rest is either useless or toxic. In the case of Fionn MacCool, of course, when he touches the salmon and he tastes it, now he has gained all of the knowledge, and no one else can have it. Finnekas, who is there, cannot have it because it has been eaten, has been used up and tasted. It cannot be divided. It can only go to one. That's exactly the feature of the fruit of knowledge in this Indian version. And we have two figures as sort of rivals to win this. That is very similar to what we have with, again, Gwion Bach and Afaglu or Morfran in the story, Ceridwen's son, who is there, who she intends the liquid for, but Taliesin accidentally wins it away from him. In the story of Fionn MacCool, it is Finnekas himself and Fionn MacCool who are both two figures there. Finnekas wants to gain this wisdom. Fionn ends up actually gaining it. The final fascinating point here is that both Ganesha and Kartikeya are seen as emanations of Shiva himself. They're aspects of himself, and so continuous with the Rudra Shiva deity, just born as sons of himself. Now, in the story of Fionn MacCool, for example, as I just said, other figure present who's trying to get the food of knowledge is also named Finn. His first name is Finn, Finnegas, Finnegas. So you have Finnegas versus Finn, trying to win this salmon of knowledge food. It's almost like they're connected on a higher level as two different aspects of one deity. That would make sense. In the tradition, it's implied and stated that Finnegas is another name of Nuada, but that doesn't answer the problem here, which is that their names are shared. It may be true that Finnegas is Nuada, but does that tell us then that Nuada himself is like an aspect of the Finn type? Regardless, you have two figures here, both of them bearing the name Finn, and therefore seeming to be pointing to at least an esoteric connection between them. As I've stated many times before, the salmon of knowledge itself is also of the Finn Rudra type, because, first of all, the salmon's name is Gall Essa Ruath, and Gall is the rival of Finn as a human, and they are actually two sides of this same Rudra type. They are two rivals showing different aspects of the Rudra, but they're the two Fianna kings, the Fiannas being the Mannerblund, the Rudra domain, the Rudra grouping, and Gall and Finn being the two prominent leaders and kings of these Fianna. And I've gone into detail showing how Gall plays out Rudra myths himself, and his very name means the one-eyed. The salmon of knowledge, Gall, goes to the well of Segish and eats the 9 hazelnuts that have fallen there, just as, of course, Odin goes to the well of wisdom to gain wisdom. He is the one-eyed, he turns into a fish. Furthermore, Fiontan, actually seems to be Gall Essa Ruath, the salmon, as well. They seem to be two names of one and the same salmon of knowledge. In any case, they are certainly continuous and being conflated in the tradition, because it is said that Fintan loses his eye at the location called Asaro. Asaro is this place with a waterfall where Fintan, who turns into a fish and also a bird, Fintan gets his eye plucked out at the location Asaro. Therefore, Fintan becomes the one-eyed at Asaro. The name of the salmon of knowledge is the one-eyed one of Asaro, Gall Essa Ruath. That's the literal meaning of Gall Essa Ruath, is the one-eyed one of Asaro, the exact location where Fintan as a fish gets his eye plucked out and becomes the one-eyed, aka Gall. That becomes the name of the salmon of knowledge, who is a fish also. They're both fish. They're both fish who are said to embody all knowledge as well. How many fish can you have that embody all knowledge without them being the same? How many one-eyed fish embodying all knowledge can you have without them being the same? These are metaphysical principles being expressed in folktales. Therefore, how can they not be drawing from the same original? Obviously, they are at this point, when you see that their one-eyedness is specifically connected to this location of Asaro as well. In both cases, they both contain all knowledge. They can't both contain all knowledge and have all these features without being the same. Therefore, the salmon of knowledge that Fionn MacCool tastes and gains the wisdom from is really Fintan, Fiontan. So the salmon of knowledge is another Finn, another aspect of Finn, because he is Fintan. Fintan becoming Gall, Gall being the other side of Fionn MacCool, the other more terrifying side, the more violent side. And so there's this continuity that is established, and I go into this much more in other places. But nonetheless, what's fascinating here is if the salmon of knowledge that Fionn MacCool eats is actually Fiontan, Fintan, another aspect of Finn himself, then he is really eating the knowledge from his own higher self, in a sense, while competing for it, in a sense, with another Finn, Finn Ekis. You have 3 Finns in this story once you realize that the salmon of knowledge is Fintan, Fintan transformed into Gall Essa Ruath, the one-eyed one of Asaro. You have 3 Finns, 3 aspects of the same name in this one story, with finally Fionn MacCool eating the food of knowledge that is also Finn/Gall named. And this ties back to what we just read here in the Indian story, which is that Kartikeya, look at this final line in the section, it is revealed to Kartikeya after he loses that he himself is the fruit of knowledge. And I've just told you before that Kartikeya is seen as a remanifestation of Shiva himself, as an emanation, a continuation of Shiva himself. Shiva being the higher god, the higher self, who himself contains all knowledge, is the divine mind itself. And Kartikeya remanifests as the fruit of knowledge itself, and the other aspect, Ganesha, who's in competition with him, eats that fruit of knowledge. Therefore, it's like a circular pattern of 3 aspects of the same god, of intellect, who is the divine mind, passing on the wisdom to his own remanifested self, and passing that on through the embodiment of himself and his knowledge in a food of knowledge that he himself is in both cases. In the case of the Indian version we see here, Shiva is Kartikeya as the fruit of knowledge that gets eaten, and Fintan is Gal Esa Ruav, the salmon of knowledge, which gets eaten and transmits that knowledge onto Fionn McCool, the reborn boy Finn aspect. It's the same very complex, yet recognizable, uncanny pattern. So this demonstrates a direct line between Fintan, Finn, and Shiva / Kartikeya / Ganesha, and that they are very much drawing from the same Rudra Shiva mythos, where it is this continuity of the one type among itself passing the knowledge on. Secondly, the one that really convinced me in particular is the story of Fionn McCool again, as the one who gains power of prophecy, fasting under a magical tree right after drinking a magical drink and going through an arduous trial that wears him down and ages him. This is the Irish equivalent. This is the Irish variant of the story that we know as Odin hanging from the tree while fasting and thereby gaining the runes being used in acts of divination. Thus, they are prophetic tools. So we have in both cases fasting beneath a special magical tree and gaining tools of prophecy or divination from that act. All of this connected to waters that turn things white, as I've noted. Odin does this over the Well of Erd and reaches seemingly into the waters of the Well of Erd. And the waters of the Well of Erd are said to turn all things white. And in the story of Fionn McCool, he first swims the lake of the Cailleach, and the waters of that lake turn all things white, so that Finn himself gets aged to an old man in his appearance. He swims the lake 3 times, a very arduous task, to retrieve a special ring. And in the story of Odin, he hangs for 9 nights in this sort of arduous asceticism, wearing him down by this act, clearly. So you have Finn swimming the lake 3 times, Odin hanging for 9 nights. This is a multiplication of the number 3. You also, as I mentioned, have the salmon of knowledge, Gal Esa Ruav, aka Fintan, eating the 9 hazelnuts from the well of knowledge. These are all repetitions of this 9 and 3 numerology. And so, as we see here in the story of the Hunt of Slieve Quillen, after Finn swims 3 times, gets aged to an old man, he then is given a magical cup to drink. The cup falls on the ground and a magical tree springs from it. To fast under this tree, he will gain the power of prophecy, specifically. So that is the direct equivalent of what Odin does. And this is the only story that really fully parallels that story of Odin in the Celtic material, if you are really looking at the details. So here we go. And so this is from the Hunt of Slieve Quillen, the version in Gods and Fighting Men. And here we have Finn going on a hunt, and he comes to a lake, and there's a girl there, and she tells him that she lost a ring of red gold and asks him to bring it back for her. He ends up having to swim the lake completely 3 full times. And then it says, and when Finn came up on the bank of the lake, he could not so much as reach to where his clothes were, for on the moment he, the head and leader of the Fianna of Ireland, was but a grey old man, weak and withered. And then it says, and as to Finn, they asked him, was there any cure to be found for him? There is, he said, for I know well the enchantment was put on me by a woman of the Sidhe, Milucrath, daughter of Quillen, through jealousy of her sister Anya. And bring me to the hill that belongs to Quillen of Cuilnia, he said, for he is the only one can give me my shape again. And at the end of that time, Quillen of Cuilnia, that some say was Manannán, son of Lear, came out of the hill holding in his hand a vessel of red gold, and he gave the vessel into Finn's hand. And no sooner did Finn drink what was in the vessel than his own shape and his appearance came back to him. But only his hair, that used to be so fair and so beautiful, like the hair of a woman, never got its own color again. For the lake that Quillen's daughter had made for Finn would have turned all the men of the whole world grey if they had gone into it. And when Finn had drunk all that was in the vessel, it slipped from his hand into the earth that was loosened with the digging, and he saw it no more. But in the place where it went into the earth, a tree grew up, and any one that would look at the branches of the tree in the morning, fasting, would have knowledge of all that was to happen on that day. Unquote. And so we can see that He is given this magical drink to drink that restores him. He then drops the vessel into the ground, and up springs a magical tree. And anyone who then looks at the branches of this tree and fasts gains the knowledge of prophecy. Of course, this is the tree of Finn, who has caused it to spring up. So he is the one associated with this tree that you can fast under and look at the branches to then gain the knowledge of the future of that day. Now, I've compared this again to the leaves of a tree that Apollo gets when he pursues Daphne. He pursues Daphne in this heart-aching pursuit, and finally he tries to embrace her, but she turns into the laurel tree. But he then grasps the leaves of her tree, and those leaves become the tools of divination, the laurel leaves, that even the Pythia, the Sibyl, uses for her divination. So the leaves of the tree of Apollo are these tools of divination. The branches of the tree of Finn here are the tools of divination. And it is the runes in the story of Odin that he gains at the very end that are then the tools of divination carried out to the world. But the runes themselves are likely carved on pieces of wood oftentimes and used to make lots, as we see in certain examples that I mention in my book. So they can, of course, be carved on stone or wood, but when they are carved on pieces of wood, it is like this continuous symbol of the branches of the tree and the leaves of the tree. All of these are tools of divination gained from this arduous trial involving a magical tree. And I show in more detail how those stories specifically align in my book. So we can see that under Fion's tree that he has brought about, one has to fast to gain this power of prophecy from the branches. In the story of Odin, when he hangs on the tree to gain the runes, he is fasting specifically. So here we read in Havamal, I ween that I hung on the windy tree, hung there for nights full 9. With the spear I was wounded, and offered I was to Odin, myself to myself, on the tree that none may ever know what root beneath it runs. None made me happy with loaf or horn. This is just poetic language saying that he was not fed the entire 9 nights. That is, he was fasting. None made me happy with loaf or horn, food or drink. And there are different translations where it's just saying food or drink. And this line, none made me happy with food or drink. He is fasting under this magical tree. And at the end, gaining runes, which are divinatory tools. And there below I looked. I took up the runes. Shrieking I took them, and forthwith back I fell. 9 mighty sons I got from the son of Bolthorn, Bestla's father, and a drink I got of the goodly mead poured out from Othrorir. Then began I to thrive, and wisdom to get. I grew, and well I was. Each word led me on to another word, each deed to another deed. Okay, runes shalt thou find, and fateful signs. But we can see that right at this moment, when he gains the runes, he gets a drink from the magical cup, Othrorir, and that drink from the magical cup makes him thrive again and gain wisdom after he has hung painfully fasting on the tree. He's given a drink which seems to restore him and give him wisdom and thriving. Okay, so it is the same set of details that we see in the Finn story quite clearly. And the argument is that if he is hanging on Yggdrasil, that below Yggdrasil is the well of Urd, the waters of the well of Urd right below the tree, so that when he has to reach to gain the runes, that he must be reaching into the waters of the well of Urd to gain them. Well, that's just like the image of Fionn McCool swimming the lake of the Cailleach to gain the ring, and then these same events happening in connection with that. So therefore, this is supported because, once again, the waters of the lake that Finn swims in this story turn all things white. The waters of the well of Urd turn all things white, and they are what whiten the trunk of Yggdrasil itself. So yes, this is the parallel, and this is one of the strong connections between Finn himself and Odin. Finn is the one who has the myth laying down the archetype of the gaining of prophetic power under a tree while fasting. That belongs to Finn and no one else, as well as going into the whitening waters at the same moment to retrieve a special magical item and being worn down so that he has to drink from a magical cup to revive his faculties and his health, all tied together into a story. Just 2 different versions, one with Odin hanging from the tree itself in the Norse version, the other one with Finn creating the tree that one must fast under at the conclusion of his story. So there are a lot of other things that connect them a lot. For instance, Finn has 2 dogs that go along with him, hunting dogs, as Odin has 2 wolves that are his companions. Odin has a special spear that is his famous weapon that never misses its mark, while Fionn McCool has a spear that is his most well-known weapon that is said to never miss its mark. In the Colloquy of the Ancients, specifically when he gains the spear Bjorga, it is said that it has never been thrown errantly and missed its mark. So that is the feature of the spear of Odin as well. Finn gains this spear from a figure named Fiacha, and Fiacha means raven, so Finn is very raven connected, and his spear itself is raven connected. All of this, the birth myth of Fionn McCool itself, I've shown, is very, very close to the birth myth of Rudra in the Vedas and Puranas and Brahmanas, if we know it, though many people don't know it. Just generally losing an eye, as Fintan does, losing an eye while also transforming into a fish and a bird. Those are all things that Odin does. Odin loses his eye, famously transforms into both fish and bird in the Heimskringla passage that I quoted last time in the Ynglinga saga. And of course, being the Mannerbund leader king itself is one of the strongest identifiers for the Rudra type, so that Fionn McCool as the most prominent leader, the most dominant leader of the Fianna, that embodies the Rudra role in itself. And as mentioned just a few minutes ago, Vastoshpati is the inventor of all arts, and specifically poetry is his domain. I just cited where poetry is his domain, and that is Rudra. Fionn McCool is the archetypal poet. So it is this weird combination of seemingly heterogeneous things such as poetry and violence coming together in this type that Fionn McCool just so happens to have, just like Rudra does. Along with being Fianna king, we also have the fact that Gwyn ap Nudd is the one probably the most prominently connected to what some interpret as the Welsh wild hunt motif. If that motif holds up, then we have Odin in a sort of connection to wild hunt, him and his wife, or Frau Holla, connected to this spectral hunt in the Norse material. And we have Gwyn ap Nudd in a similar type of connection in the Welsh material as the most prominent figure connected to that type of thing in the Welsh tradition. Gwyn is said to have hounds of the clouds. His hounds are called the Hounds of the Clouds, and they live on Cloud Mountain or something like that. And so this is this image of Gwyn seemingly riding through the clouds with his hounds, and he's connected to being the ruler over the souls or demons of the other world, and all of this stuff connects him to an image much like the wild hunt, the wild hunter. We know that Finn, his equivalent, is indeed the most prominent hunter type god, clearly, of the Irish tradition. Therefore, we can see that between Gwyn being in a wild hunt-like role in the folklore and Finn McCool being the hunter, that this can plausibly go back to a Rudra type mythos. Now, this all relies on Chris Kershaw's book and similar arguments, which have really definitively shown that Odin is the Rudra type, that Odin is this god of the Mannerbund, like the Ulfhevenar that he has, as well as the Berserker and other instantiations of this, but that it is this Mannerbund, Korios, youthful war band leader, that this was a foundational Indo-European god type known as the Rudra type, so that Odin is directly and transparently this Rudra type. And so Rudra is again this leader and father of the Maruts and of the Rudras. These are divine names of his warband, and that he is connected to the Vratyas, who are like these outsider ascetic type of figures, that he is lord of poetry, as I mentioned, and connected to esoteric practices such as the giving of the seemingly poisonously charged esoteric water to the Keshen in the Rig Veda itself. All of this stuff aligns with a specific god type, which is this frightening god who is odd-eyed. Rudra himself is said to be odd-eyed, and who connects to enlightenment, wisdom, poetry, destruction, violence, the Mannerbund, the youthful war band specifically, and being the hunter. Rudra is the hunter. Full stop. Rudra is the hunter god type. He is the archer who hunts the stag god, known as Prajapati or Daksha Prajapati, or known as the mind or Manas itself. Sometimes there's this antelope that is embodying the mind, as if Rudra is the hunter of the mind itself. We then know, of course, Cronus' name means one who strikes the mind. It is this continuous god type, this god of intellect who strikes the mind, who is the hunter in the form of Apollo being the hunter with the bow, and also the destroyer who brings plague in the Iliad, as Apollo does, etc., etc. Apollo being father of the Corybantes, who are the Greek version of the Mannerbund, the Korios. They are the Corybantes, very clearly and transparently the same type. And so please read Chris Kershaw's book, Odin the One-Eyed God, and the Indo-Germanic Mannerblend, because this really puts beyond doubt that Odin is the Rudra type. This very much clarifies what the Rudra type even is. If you don't know what that is, then the comparison to Finn and Gwyn won't make sense. But if you do know what it is, and you do know these myth types, it becomes extremely easy to see how Finn and Gwyn are continuations of this type. Even more, Rudra Shiva in the Vedas is said to be the lord of Bhutas and Ganas. He's called Ganapati, lord of Ganas. This is like referring to the troop, the Ganas, so like the war troop, like the Koryos, the war band, like the Fianna, etc. But also the Bhutas are like these goblins and ghosts. So there are in his train these sort of terrible Rudras and ghosts and Bhutas, which are, all of these different misformed, malformed, frightening spirits and sprites that join his train because he's this frightening god. Now, this is incredibly similar to how in the Welsh tradition, we have the Tylwyth Teg or the Tylwyth Gwyn, who are connected to Gwyn himself as his host, the host or family of Gwyn. And then we have the Echicon. The Echicon are more like ghosts or even maleficent spirits or sprites, similar to demons in some instances, and other times more like land-bound spirits of sorts. But there are times in the tradition where certain writers will come close to conflating the Echicon, these more maleficent sprites, the Echicon, aligning them or conflating them with the Tylwyth Teg themselves, the host of Gwyn, that follow along with Gwyn, of course. And there are other times where the Echicon are indeed separate or seemingly separate, but there's a very close contiguousness between the Echicon and the host of Gwyn himself. And of course, we know in other mentions that Gwyn ap Nudd is said to be the one who is supposed to keep contained the demons of Annwn, the Welsh otherworld, until in the end times, supposedly, he loses containment in some sense, or they overcome him, overwhelm him, and are the end of him in some way. That is unclear. It is this association of Gwyn with spirits, sprites, ghost-like beings that is incredibly similar to Shiva, Rudra Shiva himself. He has this exact same alignment, it seems, where he is the lord of these more ghoulish beings and their sort of leader or container. Even though he himself is a good god, a ruling god, it is his job to kind of be the lord of these frightening beings for his part, because he is this destroyer god, esoteric god. Now, along with identifying Finn or Eivor Finn as absolutely the best candidate for the Rudra type, the Odin type, across any metric, Finn is this best candidate for the Rudra type, and it just so happens that he is the attacker in the creation myth that I've described, killing the husbands of the Mother Earth Eru and her sisters. That is core to making this argument in the first place. It is not just the fact that the husbands of Earth are killed. It is the fact that that is done by Finn, by Eivor Finn, that specific god who has all of the supports for being Rudra himself, therefore going across to the Rudra attack myth in the Vedas. And then secondly to that is the fact that it is done by Finn, Eivor Finn, and two brothers, so that you have a trio of brothers doing that attack, exactly like you have in the story of Odin dividing earth from sky when they kill Ymir with his two brothers, so a set of three brothers in both cases. It's that layering of supports and confirmations that show you that this is something that you have to take seriously as a plausible and probable creation myth. For the Welsh version, there is another extremely fascinating support for Efnisien himself being the direct equivalent of Odin, and therefore, by Chris Kershaw's argument in her book, to Rudra himself. And this is the fact that we have the epithet or name attested of Odin of Bolverkr or Balverkr. So this is Bolverkr, Bolverkr, and this name Bolverkr, Balverkr, it means Baal worker, or Baal meaning evil. So this name means evil worker. Odin has an attested name that is evil worker. He's the one who works evil. And he is specifically referred to by this name when he drills into the mountain to eventually retrieve the stolen mead of poetry. He has to drill into this mountain and then transform into a snake to go through the passageway into the mountain to then retrieve the mead. At that moment, he is known as Bolverkr or Balverkr. So this clearly associates Odin with some possibility of being destructive, deceptive, doing misfortune to anyone, in any given instance, but it implies a general working of misfortune or evil or Baal. This already should remind us of Efnisien, whose name means hostile, and he is described as the one creating hostility and creating rifts. But even further, we have a specific equivalent of this name Bolverker in the legendary material of the Norse tradition itself. That is, in Gesta Danorum by Saxo Grammaticus, we have a figure named Bolvis. And so we can see that the first part of this name, Bolvis, is the same as the first part of Bolverker in Odin's name. So that the Bol in Bolvis seems to imply, once again, this balefulness, this evil doing. And Bolvis is said to be the brother of Bilvis. Bolvis is said to be blind. This blindness already half reminds us of Odin's loss of an eye, loss of sight. So this deformation of the vision is connected to him. And specifically, it is said in Gesta Danorum that of these two brothers, Bolvis creates hostility, destroys peace in what he does. So here we go. We have Bolvis and his brother Bilvis. Bolvis creates hatred, whereas his brother Bilvis creates friendship or peace. It is this very clear duality of two brothers. And it says that Hildigisel bribed a certain blind man, Bolvis, to bring the sons of Sigar and the sons of Hamund to turn their friendship into hatred. For King Sigar had been used to transact almost all affairs by the advice of two old men, one of whom was Bolvis. The temper of these two men was so different that one used to reconcile folk who were at feud, while the other loved to sunder in hatred those who were bound by friendship, and by estranging folk to fan pestilent quarrels. And so this is a very clear layout of their two characters. Bolvis used to create hatred. He loved to sunder in hatred those who are bound by friendship and estrange folk into quarrels. And Bilvis likes to reconcile folk and create friendship. It's even the manner in which this is laid out reminds us of the description of Efnisien and his brother Nisian. And right there we have the one who is creating hatred and enmity is named Bolvis, very close to an equivalent of one of Odin's own names, Bolverker, the same root word there. And so in the Mabinogi version, we have, and one of these youths was a good youth of gentle nature, and would make peace between his kindred, and cause his family to be friends when their wrath was at the highest. And this one was Nisian, but the other would cause strife between his two brothers when they were at peace. Okay, so we can almost see these are almost the exact same lines applied to these two sets of brothers, the one in the Danish context and the one in the Welsh context. It would take almost nothing to argue that these could come from the same original root story. So that perfectly aligns Efnisien with Bolvis as direct equivalents in different traditions. And from there, Bolvis connects directly to Odin himself, Bolverker. Bolvis being blind, Odin being one-eyed, half-blind. So if you look at these, you can quite easily establish a direct line from Odin, Bolverker, to Bolvis of the legendary layer, and from Bolvis to Efnisien, because Bolvis and Efnisien are described in almost identical terms, paired with their brother, who is more peaceful and making peace. It's extremely hard to avoid this conclusion and to sidestep this evidence that there is a direct line here between Efnisien and Odin himself, and especially the fact that Efnisien's nature and the things he does can be described as evil working or bale working, just like the name Bolverker itself. So I just found that extremely fascinating. Look at the Gesta Danorum, the Danish history by Saxo Grammaticus, and you can see two lines there, Bolvis and Bilvis, exactly almost the same as Efnisien and Nisian in the Welsh, and Bolvis equaling Bolverker, one epithet of Odin. Now, another interesting and important detail to know about is the event of the meeting of the tree ancestor that I pointed to. So it's not true to say that Gwern is the equivalent of, the source of the ancestors like I did in the other stream, just because of what happens in the myth. It's also the case that the human ancestors in multiple Indo-European traditions are tree named. So being tree named is already a key criteria for being this ancestor figure, because we have Asker and Embla. Asker seeming to mean ash, like ash tree, and Asker and Embla being found on this shore as pieces of trees that are then shaped into humans. So they are like born of tree wood, and they are named like trees. We have the ash tree nymphs in the story of Uranos. When his seed and blood fall, the ancestors of humans that come out at that specific moment are tree named. ash tree nymphs. So they're like these divine ancestors. They are nymphs, so they have a divinity level to them, and they give rise to humans as their offspring. And they are tree named, the ash tree nymphs. We have in the Iranic version found in the Bundahisen, we have that Maisha and Maisha Nag are born from the falling seed of Gaiomard. When Gaiomard is killed, again, Gaiomard has been equated to Ymir with other material by Bruce Lincoln and others. It's very clear that Gaiomard is similar to Ymir, who I'm talking about. And it is Gaiomard who gets attacked and killed, and his seed, his semen, falls into earth, as I've said. And it is then fostered by the fire god, Neryo Sang, at that moment. So you have the seed falling to earth and also being protected by the fire itself and fostered, brought to maturity by the fire that is there. From the seed that is entrusted to Neryo Sang, the fire, comes the ancestors Maisha and Maisha Nag, who are tree beings. They are tree beings in their story, and they are the human ancestors. They're the two primordial human ancestors, Maisha and Maisha Nag, tree beings in the Iranic version, because this is a consistent Indo-European motif where the ancestors are tree beings. It is not always the case. In the Vedic version, the tree aspect of the archetypal ancestors has been replaced with a specific priest caste that was important to the Vedics, the Angirases, and they don't have an obvious tree association. But you can see that they appear out of the fire, out of the seed that has fallen to earth in this primordial attack on this specific being, and from that seed that falls to the fire, falls into the earth, is born the fire youths, the Angirases, and they are the human ancestors at that point. So if you take the Greek, Iranic, Norse versions, those are all tree being ancestors born from this primordial moment. You then have to look at Gwern of the Mabinogi, and he is the offspring. He is very much the symbol of the offspring of Mafalek and Branwen. Mafalek, as I'm arguing, is in the position of the father sky of Diaush, and he is the one who is attacked by the Rudra, who is Efnisian, and his brothers. Then it is specifically Efnisian, the lead destroyer Rudra, who comes and meets Gwern. Gwern's name then means alder. He is the offspring. He has a tree name. Therefore, he symbolizes this divine essence that will give rise to the humans thereafter. He's sort of this archetypal divine symbol of the ancestor. He himself dies because he goes to the fire, like all the offspring seed does in the other versions, goes to the fire on the earth. And only thereafter the ancestors of humans will arise at the end of this very same story. And so the name of Gwern is extremely crucial in this comparison, because Gwern means alder, like the alder tree. So once again, the offspring of the sky figure, who will be the archetype of the ancestor, he has the tree name. And so it fits perfectly comparative mythology-wise. And what is also fascinating, once you understand that basic framework, you can look more speculatively at an extremely interesting scene, because we know that Asker and Embla are found by Odin and his two brothers right after they have divided earth and sky. It's in the exact same place in the myth, in the exact same mytheme or mythos. The dividing of earth and sky, which is the killing of Ymir, is directly connected with the finding of the ancestors right at the conclusion of that, because those pieces always go together, almost always. And those ancestors in Odin's story are tree named and tree formed. But what's fascinating is that after Odin and his brothers have killed and separated Ymir into earth and sky, they then come across these tree wood beings washed up on a shore that they form into humans, Asker and Embla. And what happens is, specifically, each of the three brothers approaches these tree beings as they are forming them, and each of them gives them a gift. Odin gives a certain gift, and then his two brothers, Vili and Ve, they each give a specific gift to the tree ancestors. So there's this important meeting moment between the three gods and the humans that they're forming, right at this point where they are found, right after the attack on Earth Sky. And so what's interesting is that at the moment of the attack, at the moment when Gwern, Alder, is thrown into the fire to sort of finish this moment in the Welsh version, at that very moment, Efnisian and his brothers all meet this Gwern, this Alder child, who I am saying is the sort of divine symbol of the ancestor, of the essence that will become the ancestors. And so you can speculatively compare then the scene where Odin and his two brothers meet the just found tree ancestors Ask and Embla. You can compare that to when Efnisien and his brothers meet the child named Alder, who is about to sacrificially become the essence of the ancestors. And that those two scenes of meeting, of this sort of genial meeting between the divinities, the gods who are doing this dividing, doing this creation attack, this moment where they meet the symbolic ancestor, who is tree named, probably come from the same original story motif, just split and told in slightly different ways, where in the Welsh version they're meeting this tree ancestor right before the act of violence, where the ancestor is sort of entrusted to the fire violently, whereas in the Norse version it's after the division has fully happened and the symbolic ancestor, is washing ashore in a body of water. As we know in the Vedic version, the body of liquid that appears after the attack on Skye, the body of liquid that appears is actually liquid fire, and it is the semen that has fallen. It is the fire semen. So this pit of fire is the same as the body of liquid that the ancestor washes ashore out of, because that is how it works in other branches. So we can see a continuity of images and motifs once we understand that. So here, of course, the famous event where Odin and his two brothers divide Ymir into earth and sky. Then Bur's sons lifted the level land. Bur's sons are Odin and Vili and Ve in this version. And Midgard the mighty, there they made. So then we have a section where it names certain creation events happening along with this moment, like the naming of the morning and the waning moon and night and evening, these sorts of archetypal details, and then a list of dwarfs that appear. So it's sort of a slightly monotonous list of dwarves that are appearing out of this moment. And when that list of dwarves concludes, we then have the meeting of Odin and his brothers with Asker and Embla. So here in verse 17 we have, then from the throng did three come forth, from the home of the gods, the mighty and gracious. Two without fate on the land they found, Ask and Embla, empty of might. Soul had they not, sense they had not, heat nor motion nor goodly hue. Soul gave Odin, sense gave Heinir, heat gave Lothar and goodly hue. And so in the version found in Snorri's Gylfaginning, we have, much indeed they had accomplished then, methinks, when earth and heaven were made, and the sun and the constellations of heaven were fixed, and division was made of days. Now whence come the men that people the world? And Har answered, when the sons of Bor, that is Odin and his brothers, were walking along the sea strand, they found two trees, and took up the trees and shaped men of both. The first gave them spirit and life, the second wit and feeling, the third form, speech, hearing, and sight. They gave them clothing and names. The male was called Asker, and the female Embla, and of them was mankind begotten. Okay, so when we look at that next to the Mabinogi little scene that I mentioned, it's curiously similar. Again, it's not exactly the same, and one is happening a little earlier, one's happening right after, but I think we can see that this meeting of the symbolic ancestor, who is tree named, by the three dividing gods who are the main ones, these may come from a shared original root. So let's look at that Mabinogi version. So this is right after Efnisien has killed all the men in the house who were assassins, thus cleansing the house in this Vastoshpati role. Right after this, the armies of both sides enter this house together, and it says that a kind of peace is concluded. They make a concord between them, and when peace was concluded, Bendigade Vran called the boy unto him, that is Gwern, the son of Metholach. And from Bendigade Vran the boy went unto Manawydan, and he was beloved by all that beheld him. And from Manawydan the boy was called by Nisien, the son of Iroswith. And the boy went unto him lovingly. Wherefore, said Efnisien, comes not my nephew, the son of my sister, unto me? Though he were not king of Ireland, yet willingly would I fondle the boy. Cheerfully let him go to thee, said Bendigade Vran. And the boy went unto him cheerfully. By my confession to heaven, said Efnisien in his heart, unthought of by the household, is the slaughter that I will this instant commit. Then he arose and took up the boy by the feet, and before anyone in the house could seize hold of him, he thrust the boy headlong into the blazing fire. Okay, this of course breaks the peace, and the war then continues and finally concludes. At the very end of the story, human ancestors are found in caves like the womb of the earth. And so we can see here this scene where the boy goes lovingly between the four brothers, Bendigade Vran being a half-brother, Bendigade Vran and Manawydan being half-brothers with Efnisien and Nisien, of course, but we have the boy going lovingly to Bran, then to Manawydan, and then to Nisien, and finally to Efnisien. Efnisien then does this violent sort of a sacrifice of the boy into the fire in this sacrificial-like house. And so this is very interesting because the Vedic verse, as I showed before, when this happens, it says that the seed falls upon the lap of the well-performed sacrifice. So when the seed falls to earth, the seed is like this offspring of Father Sky Diaush. When it falls to earth and bursts into the fire lake, the fire pit, rather, it says that this essentially marks the site of sacrifice. So it is a symbolic sacrifice. When Rudra Vastoshpati attacks Diaush, causes his seed to fall into the earth, the lap of earth, which bursts into a fire pit, that is the mark of the primordial sacrifice. It is a sacrifice. And not only that, the site that it marks then becomes a symbolic place of sacrifice to people coming after, and to the sages coming after refer back to it as this site of sacrifice, which is the lake of the remainder of the fire seed that is left there. So it is all in alignment, because it is very clear what Efnisien is doing is like a sacrifice, throwing a Gwern into the fire within this house. That very much is like Vastoshpati attacking the father, so that the seed of the father, which is his symbolic offspring, falls to earth in a conflagration of fire, marking the site of the well-performed sacrifice. By doing so, it is now the well-performed sacrifice, what he has done. So please just read Rig Veda 10.61, where it specifically says that about the seed fell to earth, marking the well-performed sacrifice. And from that fire seed emerges the Angirases, which are the troop of ancestors that come thereafter. So again, it is far too much to just ignore, or to try to ignore, that Gwern is named Alder, that he has a tree name, because again and again in this same equivalent moment in other Indo-European branches, the ancestors are tree named. That is the symbolic ancestor, of course. So Gwern is this symbolic source ancestor who, if you align it with others, he equates to the position of Asker and Embla, who come out of the ocean of the fluids that have come out from this event. They wash ashore on a beach after the event of the dividing of earth and sky, clearly out of the fluids of Ymir then. And the ash tree nymphs are tree named and come out of the fluids of Uranos in this moment. Maisha and Maishianag come out of the fluids of Gaiomar, the equivalent of Ymir, after this moment, and when they're entrusted to the fire, when the seed falls to earth. It is all the same events. I've gone into this kind of ad nauseum at this point, but it's important so that you understand that the position of Gwern cannot be ignored. He has this tree name, and he's in the position of the seed of Diaush, that is a symbolic ancestor falling to earth into the pit of fire in a well-performed sacrifice by the Rudra Vastoshpati type of divinity, the equivalent of Odin, who goes then across and is the equivalent of Rudra, and with very specific and thorough proofs. Now, another interesting point that is just fascinating to me is that not only does Briochen in the Irish story, in the Book of Invasions version of this myth, Briochen is the first figure to appear in this section of the story. And as Mark Scowcroft has gone into in his Laura Gawala, The Growth of the Text, Part 2, he describes how there is a conflation, that is to say, there is a redactional seam right at the point where Briochen appears, right at the point where the Sons of Mil section appears with Briochen and his sons, Briochen being at his tower. It is clear that this is an outside source, a separate redactional layer that has been stitched together. Therefore, we don't know the origin of this piece of text. We don't know what its original context was, one way or the other. But we do know that it has a beginning point, and it begins with Briochen. Therefore, this can easily answer the question of how this could possibly be a creation myth if it is taking place in a long, continuous narrative. Well, actually, the narrative is not continuous. It has seams, and we can see that this story of Briochen and his sons has been conflated in there, right at this point where you would expect, if it was a full story unto itself, being imported in and placed in this pseudo-historical continuous narrative. So, along with the fact that Briochen appears as this first figure within this redactional layer, within the text that makes the story of the Sons of Mil that we're talking about, it does have a clear beginning point, and that beginning point is with Briochen of the Tower. Like I've said, he is the equivalent of Brahman in his position and in his etymology. But not only that, we also have a separate attestation of Briochen as the very first thing and the very first ancestor of certain clan lineages in their pedigrees in Ireland. So the one that is easiest to point to is the clan of the Corcu Loigva, and forgive my pronunciation, but I showed this on screen in the previous video, but I didn't highlight it and go into it in detail. But it is so fascinating that we actually have a different text besides the Book of Invasions, where Breochan is indeed shown to be considered the very first ancestor. Not only that, but he is shown to be the father or grandfather of figures that are considered gods in other traditions within Ireland. For example, the Tuatha Dé Danann themselves, and Lu himself, the god Lu of the Tuatha Dé Danann, and his mother, Ethliu. They are both shown to be descending from this Breochan. In multiple versions of the Corcu Loigva pedigrees, we have this shown. So I'll pull this up to explain a little better. So we see right here, in multiple pedigrees, multiple versions of pedigrees of the Corcu Loigva, a prominent clan, Breochan is listed as the first ancestor, the very first coming in their pedigree, thus seeming to confirm from a separate source that some of the Gaelic nobility, who had to do with this particular legend, of course, themselves saw Breochan as the true origin point of themselves. It's very important, making your own pedigree accurate to something meaningful, of course, and that Breochan was the true origin point even prior to Tuatha Dé Danann gods. The Tuatha Dé Danann gods in particular that are seen in this pedigree are Ethliu and her son Lu, of course. But in addition to that, Lugith, who is shown as the father of Ethliu, very interestingly. Now, I've shown elsewhere that Lugith is the name of the higher self of Lu, in a sense, which the Vedics would call the Purusha itself. It is the personality of the totality of Godhead above everything, but below the absolute itself. And so that is this fire being that is the totality. But we also know that Lugith is in the Tuatha Dé Danann genealogies themselves. Lugith is the name of one of their own ancestors too, so he is shown to be divine, shown to be a god himself, just prior to the division of the Tuatha Dé Danann, because Lugith is said to be the other name of the figure Delvaith. Delvaith is this figure who is sometimes the father of the Dagda and many other gods and figures. And Lugith is, and Delvaith is said to be AKA Lugith. And Delvaith means shaping fire or forming fire or something like that, form fire. And he has the name Ive in his name because he's a fire being. But then his other name is Lugith, and Lugith is shown in his many different variants of his legends, different names, different figures named Lugith. They are frequently the divided man who is then killed in a sacrificial-like way. For example, there is one Lugith who is killed when his back is up against a standing stone and he is speared. It is like a sacrificial image, as we know. There is Lugith Red Stripe, whose own body is divided in three parts that are said to correspond to three of his fathers, because he has three fathers. So he's the divided man, all of this stuff. And then furthermore, Lugith Mac Con is the son of another Lugith. His father is named Lugith, but his father is one of 7 Lugiths. So the 7 Lugiths and the chief among them give rise to Lugith Mac Con, who then later goes on to be killed in a sacrificial tableau, being speared up against a standing stone and that sort of thing. Well, in the Shatapatha Brahmana 6.1.1, the 7 Purushas congeal to give rise to the one main Purusha. The one main Purusha is then the divided man, and he is the shaping fire of the cosmos because he is called Agni. He is a fire being, as I've tried to get across. He's actually the primordial fire. That fire then shapes the world egg itself, like a forming fire. He is this demiurgic figure, very much a craftsman of the cosmos, and he is this fire that crafts. So that all fits with what Delvaith, aka Lugith, is. The point is, we have Lugith here in this higher role. So he also is a divine name. Lugith, it's unavoidable that Lugith is a divine name because Delvaith, who is clearly a god, is called Lugith. And Lu Laufada is also called Lugith Laufada in some instances. So Lu, the lower, the later arriving Lu, is also AKA Lugith at some points. What this means is that Lugith is definitely a god name in multiple instances, in multiple places. So you have here at least 3 gods, Lugith, Ethliu and Lu himself, the later coming Lu, the lower self of the Lu, or the completed self of the Lu, they are all shown to be grandchildren, great-grandchildren of Breogan himself. Breogan is higher. Breogan is giving rise to, Breogan is fathering the gods themselves. Okay, so again, there's 3 versions, so this is not an accident. You can see that other details in these genealogies are different. The spelling of Breogan is even different, and these are different people writing these. But at the same time, they maintain that Breogan is this most important, very first ancestor, even before the gods themselves, Lugith, Ethliu, and Lu. Now that's amazing. That's incredible. And that is exactly what you would expect. That doesn't prove that Breogan is the absolute on its own, but that's exactly the uncanny thing that you would expect if Breogan was seen as the absolute, actually. That is a piece that you would need to be in place if Breogan was the absolute. So this supports the idea that Breogan is the absolute. Even though on its own it doesn't prove it, it actually goes a good way toward proving it, especially when you have this and then you combine that with the story of Breogan himself, as of course you should, and you see that what Breogan is doing is exactly what an absolute does in the Vedic tradition, for example, because almost the entire definition of the absolute is that it is prior to the division of being and non-being. That's almost the definition of the absolute. And secondly, that it is symbolized by something like a pillar or tower, because that is the symbol that we see in Indo-European traditions like the Vedic, that the symbol for the absolute is the pillar or tower. So that Breogan has the details that are almost the entire definition of what the absolute is, because being and non-being are traditionally and in the Vedic material symbolized by the sacred tree god and the waters being juxtaposed side by side in a duality. Breogan has as 2 of his children, Bila, sacred tree, Mirhevnya, the dark ocean. So when you put that together with these genealogies, and you put that together with everything else that happens in the Book of Invasions account, that is when it really becomes unavoidable that you have to take seriously Breogan as being the likely equivalent of the Brahman. He has all of the things that you would have to expect of the absolute, and it is in these sets of uncanny parallels and patterns. So Breogan is the first ancestor in certain pedigrees. Clearly, these clans used that particular name and had this particular lore. And Breogan is the very first figure appearing in this story of the Sons of Mil. He's the one at the beginning of the story. And we see there's a seam right before he appears, a redactional layer that has been stitched into this place. And we know not where it comes from or its original context in any sense. But that seam is exactly what we would expect if this was taken from a creation myth originally and placed here with Breogan as the beginning point of this particular story with its seam there. Beyond just that Finn, Aver Finn, is indeed the Rudra and Odin type. That is fundamental, and so is the fact that Efnisien is this Rudra type. Beyond that, the next piece that really confirms the picture, supports the picture that I'm explaining, is the fact that there is this connecting figure between the Brahma tree god, the god of the cosmic tree in both cases that I've explained, Bila in the Laur Gawala Eren, and Brahma or Prajapati, 2 names for the same figure in the Vedic material. Between Brahma, Prajapati, and Bila, the sacred tree gods, between them and the claimed Rudras, there is a single figure in both cases. Now, in the Vedic material, that is the figure known as Manu. So we have Prajapati, aka Brahma, who is the lord of the cosmic tree that I explained, and he is the lord of all being. He constitutes all being. He is the golden germ that emerges out of the dark waters, of course. He's then the grandfather of all gods, essentially. All gods emanate out of him. And specifically, he has a very important god that he engenders. But this comes about through an intermediary god. That is to say, there is one lineage coming from him that becomes very important, because from that lineage is born Rudra, and Rudra is this massively important god on a level with Prajapati himself, because they're a kind of duality between them that's important, as sort of two two polarized faces of the ultimate Godhead in a way. But in any case, we have from Prajapati is born his son named Manu. Manu is one of his sons. He has fathered multiple sons, including the seasons, the sun and moon, that sort of thing, these primordial sons of the ultimate grandfather of the gods. And he has fathered Manu. This Manu is sometimes glossed as fury, but this name Manu signifies one phase of the creative heat, as Stella Cromrish describes it. Now, from Manu, what happens is that Prajapati cries tears upon Manu. Manu then transforms from the tears that fall on him, transforms Manu into Rudra. So you have three steps: Prajapati, then Manu. Tears fall on Manu, he transforms there into Rudra, and that is how Rudra comes about. Now, there are other genealogies that are simplified to just saying that Prajapati is father of Rudra. But that leaves out this important step, because we really have three separate deities in a row: Prajapati, Manu, who is treated as his own deity, and then Manu is transformed by the tears of Prajapati into Rudra. Finally, Rudra comes about as this ultimate god, who then attacks Father Sky, as I've described, is the attacker and the equivalent of Odin, who attacks Ymir, dividing earth and sky, in this motif. Now, in the Laur Gawala Aaron, we have Bila, the god whose name means sacred tree. He is grandfather of Eivor Finn and his brothers, Finn being this Rudra equivalent. And there is a figure in between them. So we have the same number of steps, divine steps, theoretically here. And this is Mil Espana, right? Famously, Milesius, who is the father of the sons of Mil. It's all named after him, right? But Mil Espana, in the Book of Invasions itself and elsewhere, it says that his real name was Golav. Golav is spelled multiple different ways, including Galam and also Golam, and variations on that. So we are told that Mil has a true name, and that is Golav. It seems to me, just looking at it, that Mil is some sort of, Latinized name, right? It sounds like a Spanish word, or some kind of Latinate version of his name. And Mil just means soldier, of course. And when we look at his true name, then, that is an Irish name. That is a Gaelic word, a Gaelic name. So that is probably his original name in the text, and that's what the texts are telling us. So we really have to look at this name Golav instead of Mil for what the true etymology underlying this was. Now, when we look at Golav, Galam or Golam, what we find is that the translator of Keating's History of Ireland, and that is O'Mahony. O'Mahony is this translator of Keating's History of Ireland. When we look at how O'Mahony treats this name, he specifically etymologizes it as Gal, Gal, and then a suffix. And right here, if we pull this up, all right, so this is from Geoffrey Keating's The History of Ireland, translated by John O'Mahony. And so O'Mahony is the one who is writing the footnotes here. And so we have, of course, Mil Espana Milesius, i.e. Galav, Galamh, son of Billy, son of Breogan. And so that shows us who we're talking about. Mil is the same as Galav. And when he goes down into the footnotes, it says Galav. The name Galav may mean the same thing as Milith. So as you can see, this is kind of what I was suggesting, that Milev is this Spanish or Latinate word meaning the same thing. That means a warrior, generally speaking. So it's like a Spanish or Latinized translation of the original name Galav. That makes perfect sense. But when we look at the derivation, the actual etymology of the word, O'Mahony says derived from Gal, Gal, meaning battle, bravery, etc., by the addition of the suffix mh, just as with brehev, a judge, is formed from breh, judgment, etc. Okay, so you can see it's cogently and simply etymologized there as coming from Gaul. Well, he gives a very general summary of what Gaul means, but what is the more technical root? What is the technical etymology of this word gall that he's pointing to? We can actually go to Wiktionary, we can go to etymological dictionaries to see a fuller picture of what this root means in itself. So if we go to Wiktionary, we can go to gall, and then we will just look at the Irish etymology here. In its Old Irish form, which we should look at, which is important, it specifically just means ardor, secondary meaning fury. So ardor and fury are really what we are looking at with this root, especially at the Old Irish level. Ardor and fury. So let's circle those in our minds, ardor and fury. We should also say that Encyclopedia Britannica, specifically the edition from the 1880s, also translates Gallav as from Gaul, meaning valor. So they are etymologizing it as generally meaning valor, but they are using this exact same root, Gaul, G-A-L. So there is agreement that the name Gallav, G-A-L-A-M, G-A-L-A-M-H, comes from G-A-L, the same G-A-L that we are talking about, meaning valor, ardor, fury. Now, we have this figure Manu, who I've described in the Vedic material. Manu is the transitional divinity, the transitional god between Prajapati and the completed Rudra, the god who is coming, the god Rudra, this important god. There's a transitional god in the middle who is called Manu. Now, I will, just to recap who Manu is, let's look at this description from Stella Cromrish. So, this is another account of the birth of Rudra from Prajapati, given in the Shatapatha Brahmana. Here it is said that when Prajapati spent himself into creation, all the gods, that is to say, the gods who are the seasons, sun and moon in this story, they abandoned him, except Manu, fury. Okay, now let's remember that we were just looking at Gaul. The first two meanings of Gaul were ardor and fury. So here, Stella Cromrish is etymologizing this as fury, because that is one of the primary accepted etymologies. Now, Manu, fury, who sparkled like fire. Shatapatha Brahmana 9.1.1.6, CF Rig Veda 10.84.2. Manu, creative fury, and tapas, creative heat, are as close to each other as are Manu and Kama, creative desire. Compare Atharva Veda 9.2.23, and in that Atharva Veda hymn, it simply identifies Manu with Kama. So it calls Kama by the name Manu, implying that there are 2 degrees of the same creative heat. So that is what Stella Cromrish says. They are degrees and aspects of the creative fire. Prajapati cried. His tears fell on Manu, and Manu became Rudra of 100 heads, 1,000 eyes, and 100 quivers. Okay, so this is the myth. Okay, so we see that Manu is fury, and he is specifically the creative fury, the creative heat overflowing from Prajapati, right, as fury. If we go to the encyclopedia definitions of Manu, we can solidify this, because we saw that Gaul, its first definition is actually ardor, right? Its second definition is fury, matching with this name Manu. But what if the name Manu is actually etymologized as both fury and ardor? That would be a bit too coincidental, right? That would be like a party trick almost, having something that exact. That couldn't be possible. But let's look at this. Let's look at this encyclopedic etymology of Manu. So you can see this is from wisdomlib.org, which collects the Cologne digital Sanskrit dictionaries, and we look at Manu. Manu, a mood, temper of mind, high spirit generally. And then what's the very first specific definition that we see? Ardor. Ardor, zeal, passion, then wrath, anger, and fury. We then see down here in this next Cologne Digital Sanskrit Dictionary, Manu, spirit, generally a type of high spirit, but high spirit or temper, ardor, passion. And the next definition, rage or fury. Also personified, especially as Agni or Kama, or as Rudra. So we see that consistent identification between Manu and Kama, as well as the connection with Agni, the fire, the heat. It is an expression of the creative heat of Agni, for example. So we have right here Manu etymologized specifically as a general kind of spirit, but specifically ardor and then fury. In the Gallav, if we go back to Gaul, ardor, fury, valor. So we can see that this is incredibly close, nearly exact. And This is, once again, not just a one-off coincidence. This is a figure in the exact right position as the son of the god of the sacred tree, who is all being. That is the intermediary step coming between this sacred tree god and then the Rudra. And when the Rudra is born, as after 1, 2, 3, boom, 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 sacred tree god, god of ardor and fury, then from that arises the Rudra finalized, and that Rudra does this specific myth that we're talking about. So this is like a skeleton, this is like a spinal column of these events that are incredibly consistent across the board. You have to add this with all the other coincidences that we have, and the probability of the combination of these things being this exactly aligned becomes exponentially impossible to explain away. So those are the most important things to clinch this picture. The fact that we can confirm that Finn is the Rudra type by an immense amount of other argumentation, other evidence that I have laid out on my channel and in my book. And then the fact that actually we have this 3 steps that are almost identical between this Irish creation myth and the Vedic one. It is the god of the sacred tree who's juxtaposed with the dark waters. And from that figure comes the god of ardor/fury. And that ardor/fury god then gives rise to the Rudra. That Rudra, of course, in the case of Odin, appears in an array of specifically 3 brothers. That is the seemingly Northwest European version of this, shared between the Celtic and Norse. Odin and his 2 brothers, Eivor Finn and his 2 brothers. They become the specific attackers of the unity of earth and sky, which can be portrayed in a marriage or a double being. And those things all come together to confirm the picture that these are not accidental motifs or mere echoes. They're actually specific names that have been preserved. You don't preserve the name Galav, meaning specifically ardor and fury, and coincidentally matching with Manu, without this being an intention and without this carrying the intention that this is representing a mythological divine figure. And lastly, we have Mil, aka Galav. He is called in the Laur Gawala Erin, the Tuatha Dé Danann book, section 64. He is called the great hero who burst out of Spain without growing cold. So he is embodying heat, a heat that doesn't grow cold. That is exactly what Manu is. He is the furious ardor, the creative heat of Prajapati, identified with Agni because he is this creative heat. He's the other side of creative desire. But there we have a specific confirming description of Galav. He is the great hero who burst out of Spain without growing cold. So scholars who try to say that there is no creation myth or that they can know that there is no creation myth clearly overextend themselves beyond what they can know and what they have actually done the due diligence to establish. Then, as often happens, they will coyly claim that they don't need to give evidence for this massive claim, the claim that the Celts have no creation myth, as if they are this one and only tradition that didn't think it important to preserve a creation myth, despite them having such a vast body of preserved literature. Once again, comparative mythology is the only discipline, the only methodology that can answer the question of whether the Celts have a creation myth. And so each scholar needs to prove that they have actually been thorough and done the due diligence. There's also nothing whatsoever to suggest that Macecht and his brothers and Eriu and her sisters are not divinities. They are children or grandchildren of divinities, specifically gods among the Tuatha Dé Danann, such as the Dagda and Delvaith. These are the fathers or grandfathers of Eriu and Macecht and these figures. So yes, one does need evidence to show that the Irish are somehow completely different from every other tradition and somehow forgot to preserve a creation myth. This requires actual evidence of some kind that can make us more confident that the person saying this hasn't just been superficial in their investigations. Now, lastly, we have Stella Cromrish summarizing this myth of Manu, this myth involving the coming of Rudra, and then what Rudra's nature is in this whole picture. So this, once again, will clarify what is going on here. Rudra's assault on the father was both an act of revolt and an act of involvement. As Agni, he prepared the seed for the father and made his passion flare up. Turning against his own commitment, Agni Rudra then directed the arrow against the father, and the passion of his interrupted embrace turned into fury. All the gods abandoned Prajapati except one, Manu, wrath. It is Agni, the creative fire, who prepares the seed and inflames the father toward the creative act. It is Rudra whose arrow hits the father and interrupts the creative act. The arrow is aimed toward the origin and against the emission of the seed. Moreover, as Agni prepares the seed, he is the primeval agent who acts on the father. As Agni Rudra, he is the protagonist of the drama of creation, leading into it and lashing back, letting the arrow fly against it. His arrow will be sent flying in the cosmos. So this, once again, summarizes what we see with Efnisien. He sets things in motion, but then turns and lashes back against it, attacking the offspring of the father, which is Gwern. This is a very unique paradox in lore, in folklore and myth, and this belongs to a specific god type. It is that he has set things in motion in his fire aspect. That is, he himself, Efnisien, as well as Manawydan and his other brothers, they have set things in motion, and they have provided the sacred juice, that is equivalent to the seed. And then Efnisien, like Rudra, has turned and lashed back against the offspring, the seed of the father, that is Gwern, or the seed of Diaush. And so this paradox appearing here with Efnisien should confirm what we see in all of the other details coming together, making this a creation myth. So if we pull up the Electronic Dictionary of Irish online, or EDIL, we can see that this original sense of gall is confirmed as meaning a kind of seething heat. So here we have gall, and we read, possibly original sense is seething heat passing into that of mental excitement or rage. Then we get the meanings warlike ardor, fury, and valor coming from this original sense and being applied in an extended way. But seething heat passing into that of mental excitement or rage, you could not pick a more perfect synonym, a more perfect direct equivalent to Manu than this word, especially with its focus on heat as the centering concept, seething heat that becomes fury, ardor, valor. And this is even depicted in a figurative way, like to boiling. And because of this, we see that there are further derived words from this root that specifically mean steam or some kind of boiling and vapor and that sort of thing. So if we go here, we see of animals that it means, this is the same word continued, and it says of animals, heat or fury specifically. And then down here we get to the second meaning, the B meaning, is actually steam, vapor, or mist. So the concept at the root of this we can see is this kind of steaming, this kind of seething heat, as they said, that is like an effusion of steam, figuratively. And so therefore we get these words relating to steam and boiling. Under the Irish etymology, once again, we read that it is, ardor, valor, fury, and then vapor, steam, or boiling heat. So yeah, this is perfectly what Manu is, because Manu is literally the overflow of heat from Prajapati, the overflow of the creative heat that is like his ardor, but also veers into becoming fury and wrath, and therefore at his extremity becomes Manu. That Manu then, of course, is transformed by the tears of Prajapati into his next stage, which is Rudra. And finally, we see some of these examples of words derived from this word, a grammatical form of gall, and this becomes, of course, valor, but also steam, vapor, steam engine, release of steam, hiss of steam, generation of heat, of steam, of gas. It's all perfectly connected to the concept of what Manu is in relation to Prajapati and his role in the myth. So this name perfectly fits the Manu type, and therefore it has been perfectly and intentionally preserved and carefully preserved for this figure Galav, who is aka Mil. Mil is then just a secondary translation of the Irish meaning preserved in Gaul, translated into this more narrowed concept of the warrior ardor. The warrior ardor becomes the warrior Mil, España, the soldier from Spain. But he is originally Galav, and this is just the word Gaul with a suffix, and that word Gaul means seething heat of ardor and fury, exactly like Manu. And Gaul is also a common element of certain names, so it is well known and used, found in names such as Fergal and Brangal, Fearghal and Branghal. So the meaning of this root is pretty much clear, and then we can see the more original meaning, the specific meaning pertaining to the seething heat of the ardor and the fury in the Edil and other etymological dictionaries, underlying the core meaning of this word. Now, in the Atharva Veda hymn to Manu, we see that indeed he is portrayed as a warrior and as one who gives the warrior vigor to the warriors. So, come hither, Manu, mightier than the mighty, smite with thy fervor for ally our foemen. For thou art, Manu, of surpassing vigor, fierce, queller of the foe, and self-existent, shared by all men, victorious, subduer, vouchsafe to us superior strength in battles. Come in thy proper form and give us vigor. So we can see that Manu is seen as this warrior god who gives the warrior vigor. Thus, the figure Gal or Galav makes perfect sense as meaning warrior ardor, and then his name getting translated into the more Latinate name Milesius or Mil, meaning the soldier. The other thing that shows how impossible it is to write off the Book of Invasion's account as not somehow a myth and not somehow pertaining to the first times as a myth is the full set of names and how they are, many of them, very clearly god names. So first of all, it's very clear that Eriu, her name meaning Ireland itself, and her two sisters also being names of Ireland, that she has an incredibly easy case for being probably a goddess, because of course she's embodying Ireland. That is a divine role, and as I've argued, that can be a microcosm of the earth itself. She then is in a sort of marriage that gets disrupted, just as Gaia's does. But then we of course have Bila, meaning the sacred tree, and Mirhevnia, the dark ocean. These are abstract, metaphysical type of names that should shout out to us that they could be divine names. We then have Eivor Finn himself, with Finn being very clearly a likely divine name, comparing to Gwyn ap Nudd in the Welsh tradition, and Gwyn being treated like a spirit, a divinity of war and destruction and the underworld. And then we have Lugith, who I just mentioned. Lugith as this higher aspect of Lu on this level of the Purusha, as I've described, the divided man who is also actually the forming fire of the universe. He's a fire being in himself who forms the cosmic egg, like a sort of craftsman of fire, but also being a divided sacrifice in himself. We then also have Eivor Down, who I have shown has a very strong argument for being the god of the dead, equivalent to Yama, with also being equivalent to Bran, asking his men to carry his body to a specific southwestern isle after this event concludes, so that he can have this symbolic presence there. And then having these other alignments with Yama himself and other severed head gods and that sort of thing. This supports that Down is absolutely a divine name. In the folklore, he is treated as a sort of divinity. But that's not everything, because I only gave the skeleton core of this argument in order to get people on the right path so that they can investigate for themselves, so that they can see that there is too much here to just ignore and to just say we have no creation myth. You then have their father, Galav, with this specific etymology, directly comparable to the immediate predecessor of Rudra in the Vedic genealogy. You then have this figure whose name is Sacred Tree. Of course, that can potentially be a mythological divine name. Dark Ocean or Dark Waters is a clear potential divine name. Breochan comes from the Proto-Indo-European root shared with the most prominent etymology of Brahman. And we also have Lugith appearing in this story as the another grandson of Breochan is Lugith. Lugith is a divine name. Also, we see it used interchangeably with Lu himself. Lu is sometimes called Lugith. And so it is a potential and clear possible divine name. So therefore, all of these figures are bearing specific divine names. That is nearly the definition of what a euhemerized myth would do and does. It doesn't need to do more than that for it to be a potential euhemerized myth with this very clear contour that I've laid out. At that point, it becomes dishonest to say that you know that there is no creation myth, either here or elsewhere, because simply no one has positively given strong evidence for a lack of a creation myth. No one has given strong positive evidence for there being no creation myth. This has not happened or been established. So that series, actually, from Bila, the sacred tree god, to Goliv, and then specifically to Eivor Finn and his brothers, Finn being the confirmed Rudra equivalent, Odin equivalent. It is that series that is really the spine of this creation myth parallel, because it is this uncanny replication of a very specific and precise 3 figures in a row. The sacred tree, god of being, who is immediately juxtaposed with the dark ocean. From him is born the god of the ardor, fury, and the heat. The heat of ardor and fury overflows out of him. And then from that comes the Rudra, who then does the specific attack on Father Sky, who's in the middle of a union with his other half in a primordial unity with Earth. And from that specific attack that Rudra does on Father Sky, the seed falls, which is the symbolic ancestor of all humans. The ancestors arise out of this sacrificial fire that has occurred. And in Western branches, at least, including the Iranic but not the Vedic, the ancestor that arises here is often named with a tree name. It's a tree ancestor, so the symbolic offspring of Sky that turns into the ancestors symbolically has this tree name. So all these things and many more things that I've pointed to confirm from all sides that the spine of this creation myth is indeed there, and it is indeed replicated. The sacred tree god, the god of the heat of ardor and fury, that is this Manu type, and then the Rudra emerges right after that from that god, and that Rudra does a specific attack on the other half of Earth, which is symbolically Sky. So this is why I call this a royal flush. I've called it the Briochen royal flush, because it is like if you had these cards at a game, it almost feels unfair because you hit every single point in specific order. It is impossible to simply fabricate that. And yeah, it's like you pull up each card and it is a nearly exact match, like that etymology of gull. You go to look for that etymology and you think it can't be exactly the same, and it is nearly exactly the same. Manu, who is specifically called Fury and is also aka equated with ardor and the heat of creation. So yeah, it is really a royal flush that cannot be set aside casually, and you can kind of tell if someone is serious about this issue in the first place if they take this amount of evidence stacking up seriously or not. It's not like everyone has to agree on every point, but you can tell by how seriously someone takes this level of correspondence. You can tell if they are serious about the issue. And even before that, 3 in a row of the sacred tree god, the ardor/fury god, and the Rudra, who does the attack. Even before that, of course, we have the lined up figures of the pillar lord at the top and his the duality of 2 of his sons, who are the sacred tree and the dark ocean, right? So what I always think of is if you were to find like a piece of old, ancient, whatever, a scribbling somewhere, something written in the sands of Egypt, whatever, an ancient object that you don't know the origin of, you don't know even if it's man-made, man-written, or whatever. You don't know the society that wrote this down, what have you. Let's say you read the letters A with a little 2 up next to it, like A squared. You might first think, well, that's kind of coincidental. It looks like A squared, but who knows? This could be like a circle meaning something else, and that could be like a zigzag. Well, if you then see next to it plus, and then something that looks like B, and then another square, the squared looks the same as the A squared, so it looks like you have A squared plus B squared. Well, now you might start thinking, okay, this is curious, but it's only two items in a row. They're starting to become possibly complex, but this could still be an accident of nature. Maybe maybe there was some some waves of the ocean scrawled this and just happened to get lucky this time and make a squared plus b squared, or something that looks like that, but it could be an accident, or perhaps if this was on an ancient papyrus, you might think, well, maybe they understood these symbols to mean something else. It's only 2 data points, so you don't really know what they're talking about when they have these. Their little squiggle, their little 2-looking squiggle could mean something else, and all of that. Well, then if next to that you see equals c squared, c with a 2 up there, it's all the 2's are matching. You start scratching your head and you start saying, okay, we have three complex symbols side by side. They're all complex. They're interlocking exactly as you would expect, with a squared plus b squared equals c squared. And let's say, this could be in a different language. This could be in Egyptian letters and numbers, or whatever. You can think of this analogy in different ways, of course. But you see these symbols starting to line up. Now you have 3 points interlocking with the correct equations between them at a certain point. At that point, you have to say, now the interlocking symbols have become too many, where the probability of this now being just an accident, that the waves of an ocean or a scribe trying to write something different or using these symbols to mean something different, now the probability of that being the explanation has become astronomically unlikely. These, with the addition of each individual complex symbol that then interlocks in the same or seemingly the same way, the probability of this being an accident or not meaning a similar thing as what we know it to mean becomes more exponentially unlikely, until it becomes actually the worst explanation to say that this was probably an accident. There is a tipping point of interlocking complex symbols where it becomes much more perspicacious, much more cautious, much more honest, and much more probable that this means an equivalent or similar concept as the interlocking symbols that we know to be a squared plus b squared equals c squared. And again, you could picture this in ancient Egyptian letters and numbers of an equivalent sort, but a certain level of interlocking complex symbols in the same way with the same expected connections. We have to understand where honesty comes in interpreting these and seeing where that tipping point is. And to me, oftentimes it is this third unit, this third item, which can begin to, depending on the data, can indeed cause this sort of tipping point. So when I see, to apply that to this set of symbols, when we have the pillar lord, the lord of the pillar, and first of all, let me just say that the word skamba in Sanskrit means both pillar but also tower. So if you look at Wiktionary, it gives the definition of skamba as pillar and then secondarily tower. So tower is one of the meanings of skamba. They are interchangeable symbols, but they're also both possible meanings of the Vedic word, showing us just how tied together and interchangeable those words really are. So we see that right here. Skamba, first meaning prop, pillar, support. Second meaning tower. So yes, they are meanings bound together, interchangeable. So the tower of Briochen equals the pillar of the Brahman, the skamba, and there's no issue there. So when we look at Tower Lord as, again, the beginning point of this redactional piece of the Book of Invasions, Mark Scowcroft in his Laura Gawala, The Growth of the Text, Part 2, he mentions how this is a redactional seam. Right at this redactional seam, beginning the Milesians episode, starting with Briochen and his sons, his grandson Mil, that begins at the point right where Briochen arrives and builds his tower, and his sons leave the tower. So Briochen is this acceptable beginning point of this story within the redactions. That does not tell us anything about the origin of this story, of course. It doesn't tell us it's a creation myth just because there's a redaction. But there being a redaction right at the point supports the idea that this is a beginning point of its own type of story that's been brought in from who knows where. Therefore, Briochen can be seen as the starting point of this particular episode. So when we have as the first figure in this story, the Lord of the Tower, Briochen, and we then have his most important central son is Bila, because all of the sons of Mil come from Bila. All of the central figures of the episode that is told come from Bila. Very convenient because he's, of course, the sacred tree figure. Interesting. But if we just look at the Lord of the Tower followed by Lord of the Tree, that's actually interesting because we already are getting complex symbols interlocking in an unexpected and interesting way. Why, for example, should the most important son of the Lord of the Tower be Lord of the Tree? Those are semi-redundant symbols, and in any case, it is very coincidental that they happen in this order. It is very interesting. A tree is like a tower in bloom, and there's already some content, some material being communicated by the fact that we have these one after another. If I saw anywhere else in literature the Lord of the Sacred Tree following directly after the Lord of the Tower, I would take note. I would look closely at that, because why do you have that? These are symbols. They are there. You have to see how they're interlocking. It's already giving you an image that is partially comparable to the Vedic material, where you have beginning the Lord of the Tower and then Brahma Prajapati, the Lord of the Sacred Tree, as his next embodied emanation, so to speak, as the god he gives rise to. You have these two in a row. So you already are working with a pair of interlocking complex symbols in an order that is slightly unusual, because they are related symbols, pillar and tree, slightly redundant, but yet contrasting in the exact way we would imagine with the development of the creation myth, comparable to the Vedic. When we then add a third closely tied symbol to this picture, which is of course the brother of Bila, that is Mirhevnya. Mirhevnya means dark ocean. Mirhevnya means dark ocean. And so you now have the vertical interlocking symbols and two horizontal interlocking symbols, and they form a sort of triad of symbols that interlock in, once again, an unusual sort of way. And so when you see Lord of the Tower giving rise to Lord of the Tree, that's you can scratch your head and say, well, that could be an accident. But then when you have horizontally the Lord of the Dark Ocean as the brother, then juxtaposed side by side with the Lord of the Sacred Tree, you have now multiplied exponentially the unlikelihood of these three complex symbols interlocking in this exact pattern. You've multiplied the unlikelihood of that happening accidentally, because this is a complex set of symbols that you don't just see cropping up from the ocean waves, making these signs happen in order. As Joseph Lennon says, these are origin legends that have been woven together. We have to think seriously about the possibilities here. And yeah, it is similar to the a squared plus b squared equals c squared. When you add in this horizontal axis of the duality of dark ocean and sacred tree, then the sort of complex unusualness of tower, then tree, dark ocean, then paralleled with that tree, the improbable nature of those three symbols aligning exactly as we would expect them must be taken much more seriously. And that is, again, only sort of the starting point, this triad of figures that are in this improbable order, interlocking exactly as we would expect in an Indo-European creation myth comparable to the Vedic. When you then add what I just said, Bila to Ardor/Fury, Golav, from there directly to Averfin, Averfin being the Rudra. When you add that, it becomes closer to an advanced algebraic equation being duplicated magically in an ancient manuscript and trying to act like they weren't intentionally putting those algebraic symbols together. It becomes far too much of a stretch to simply write those kinds of things off. Because yes, the waves of the ocean, the waves of accidental scribes writing these down, they do not put these detailed symbols in this interlocking order by accident. These kinds of things don't happen to this degree or even close. So again, the Rudra has as his father/grandfather the sacred tree god Brahma/Prajapati, with this intermediary step who is Manu, who is his own deity, Manu/Kama, and he then develops in the next step to Rudra. So it's the same order of three, and you have there Averfin just so happens to have as his grandfather Bila, sacred tree god. He then just so happens to put a bow on this whole picture and do the exact thing that we would expect in a creation myth, which is to attack the male half of Mother Earth, which is consistently everywhere else symbolically sky in some sense, and in whatever sense the Irish brought down in their tradition and how they understood it, of course. So to just go through this little chart, we see Breochan, Lord of the Tower, Brahman, the Lord of the Skamba pillar. Skamba means pillar or tower. Now, Breochan comes from the PIE B superscript H, ERG superscript H, and this is the most accepted etymology of Brahman, the absolute in the Vedas. We see that this is understood as the root of Brahman in the Sanskrit dictionary of Monier Williams, the most eminent Sanskrit dictionary, and repeated in other etymological dictionaries since then. From there, Bila is born, the sacred tree god, and has the brother Merhevnia. Therefore, they are horizontally juxtaposed, Merhevnia meaning dark ocean. This is three complex symbols in this horizontal and vertical orientation, exactly as we would expect. With the Brahman, we see that from the Brahman and his Skamba pillar come the waters and Brahma, as it says in the Atharva Veda hymn, and they are juxtaposed horizontally in that hymn, the waters and Brahma. Non-existence and existence. Those are the same symbols said in other words, essentially. And yes, that dark and soundless ocean is made explicit in the Nasadiya Sukta, creation hymn of the Rig Veda. From Bila is born Galav, meaning ardor, fury, seething heat. From Prajapati Brahma is born fury, or ardor, or creative heat. This overflow of heat, which is equated also with creative desire. It is the creative heat in the form of fury and ardor. From Galav is born Averfin and his other brothers, the sons of Mil. Averfin, Avergin, and Erevan being the three in question, who then attack the husbands of the Triple Earth, Eriu and her sisters. And in the Vedic version, Rudra arises from the transformation of Manu by Prajapati. Causes a transformation, bringing about the next god, which is Rudra. Rudra is equated with Agni repeatedly and in the Rig Veda as well. And Rudra is called Shiva and is asked to be Shiva in the Rig Veda. So Rudra has two other sides, Agni, the fire itself, and Shiva, the peaceful, tranquil side. So those make his three main faces in the Vedas. And so he is, technically speaking, Rudra, Shiva, Agni. Rudra / Shiva / Agni. Those are the represented faces in the Western European branches, such as Odin, Heinir, and Lothr. Lothr seems to come from a verb meaning to blaze. Heinir is this passive, overly passive god who is focused on being prophetic, a prophet. And he is said to be the mud king, the Ar Kernig. And Ar, the mud, is said to make things white. The sacred Ar, used by the Norns to wash the tree Yggdrasil, turns things white. It has a white quality in many of the myths. And interestingly enough, Avergin, who would be the Shiva of the Irish brothers, Avergin is this prophet, this prophetic poet who passes judgments which seem to try to lay the foundations of possible peace and that sort of thing, but he passes judgments, and he is called White Need. Now remember, Heinir is called the Mud King, the Ar Konig, and the mud makes things white. This is often depicted as like a stork who walks in the mud. He's the king of mud. And so if you picture someone walking in mud that turns things white, then it would turn your legs whitened from the mud. Avergin is called White Need. Now, this is just a more speculative extension of this parallel. This isn't a confirming anything, but it is interesting to note that Avergin has white knees, and those are not explained, white need, while Heinir, the prophet of that trio, is the Ar Konig, the mud king, and it is this whitening mud. I think there is a meaning behind this that connects them, and there is more to explore on that issue, but it is fascinating. Core to those figures, of course, though, like I said, is Averfin, and Finn being the lord of the Fianna, the hunter god, who sometimes is frightening, as in the story of Diarmid and others, but is also a healer, a possible healer. He holds in his hands the power of healing with water, as also we see with Rudra being the lord who inflicts destruction and also heals. Now, there's more to that, of course. You can compare this IOTH or ITH figure in the Irish to Viraj or Viraja in the Vedic, and I think there is more there which can be explored etymologically, but it becomes more complex. You don't really need that to confirm the core, the spinal column of this creation myth, the contours are more than enough to establish that this is a creation myth and cannot be fully explained without acknowledging that as the origin of why these figures are in these orders, why these symbols are interlocking on multiple levels, many in the exact same sequence, interlocking in this way, cannot be explained without acknowledging that this is the origin of why they are in those places in the first place and doing the things that they are doing. Then there is this figure Hlasar from the story of Branwen, daughter of Llŷr. And what's interesting is that you can very clearly and convincingly explain Hlasar with this Vedic creation myth parallel in detail, but without it, it becomes nearly impossible to really explain satisfyingly what Hlasar is even doing in this story and who he is. So I would really like to hear who Hlasar is outside of a creation myth context, because it is this funny, very, very cryptic little story that seems almost impossible to explain logically or in a historicizing kind of way, because again, it is this metaphysical, esoteric thing happening in this story, and it's in the exact correct spot for the Vedic parallel, because Hlasar parallels the figure known as the Purusha, specifically explained in the Shatapatha Brahmana. Now, what happens with Hlasar is that his story is told as the prelude to the events of the Branwen story, where Efnisien attacks Matholwch and his son, and that whole dividing earth and sky mythos. And so the story of Hlasar is told as this event that happened just before, preceding that. And what happens in the Shatapatha Brahmana is preceding the creation of earth sky, which gets divided, we have the Purusha. And the Purusha is this fiery Godhead being. He is the totality of everything, and he is the primordial fires formed into a singular being, a persona, that is the Purusha. But what happens specifically with the Purusha is that he is frightening to the other gods. He is called Death and the Ender and the Year. And the year implies the totality of time, bringing things to a close. And thus this frightens the gods, that he is this fire being who is death and the ender. And so the gods say they must sacrifice, they must kill this Purusha in order to try to gain immortality through this sacrifice, actually, is what is underlying this. But the key elements are that the gods were afraid of the Purusha, who is death and the ender, and so they invented this Purusha sacrifice, where they enclose the Purusha in these sacrificial bricks, forming a fire altar to enclose him. They then put food and drink into the Purusha, who is the fire that they are sacrificing within the altar. It is said that they put food into him throughout this whole sacrificial process, and then they heat him and cook him in this sacrificial altar enclosing. After that, it causes the soma, that is the sacred sap or fluid, to rise up in him, also purifying this Purusha of his impurities through the burning. And when the soma has risen up, the priest can extract it and retrieve it from this sacrifice that they have been doing. So he retrieves the sacred liquid from this process. And after this, the Purusha actually emerges from being sacrificed, because he is immortal, actually. He can't really be killed, but he is symbolically sacrificed. He then emerges renewed and refreshed, and to kind of restart a new cycle and that sort of thing. And he then precedes and gives rise to the unity of earth and sky that is then divided. So what do we have in the story of Hlasar? Hlasar is this figure who is said to be terrifying, terrible to look at, but he then goes to the land of Matholwch, and Matholwch says that he hosts him there, not grudgingly, so happily, for a year. Now, again, the Purusha is said to be the year, And it is said that the sacrifice goes on for a year of the Purusha. It is then said that throughout this year, the people of Matholic's land become uncomfortable. They become hostile toward Hlasar because Hlasar is giving rise to outrages of some vague type. And because of this, they say, we must enclose Hlasar in an iron house with his wife and his family. And so they enclose Hlasar in this iron house with they get all their smiths together to build this iron house around Hlasar. They then heat this iron house with fire, with hot coals. But strangely, during this time, it is said that they then are giving food to Hlasar and his family inside this iron house where they are cooking him. That is exactly what is happening in the Purusha sacrifice, because the Purusha is actually this symbolic fire that is being fed this sacrificial food to reinvigorate and renew him, and thus renew the sacrificer by doing this. Then Hlasar bursts out of this iron house when it finally finishes heating him and his family, and him getting this food all the while. He bursts out and exits with his wife. Then Hlasar basically flees and brings with him this magical cauldron. And the magical cauldron symbolizes the primordial sacred liquid, of course, like I said, which then is given to Matholic, just as the sacred sap or soma is given by Agni to Father Diaush. But we have here Hlasar emerging out of this ordeal of the iron house, being cooked and fed in the iron house, bursting out, and he emerges and he goes with this sacred cauldron to Bran, and Bran gains this cauldron from him there. Just as the Purusha, when he's heated, it is said that the soma, the sacred liquid, rises up in him so that the priest can retrieve it and take it from the sacrifice, being purified thereby. So it is this exact sort of conclusion of what happens is the sacred liquid has been kind of purified and brought out of this primordial cooking inside of this sacrificial enclosure, while the Purusha figure is being given the food all the while. So it's very clearly and obviously, it is very clear and obvious that this episode of Hlasar is indeed a sacrificial tableau, because it's someone being cooked inside a fire in an enclosure. This is very this is classic sacrificial imagery. You can easily say he's being symbolically sacrificed, but he doesn't actually die. He bursts out and emerges exactly as the Purusha doesn't actually die, but emerges with this sacred liquid as if it has been perfected and risen up and been processed. And finally, like I said, it is in the exact position in relation to the division of earth and sky as the Purusha himself is in relation to the creation and then division of earth and sky, because the Purusha is this one level up from the sky-earth events. It is the prelude. The Purusha is the prelude to the creation and then division of earth-sky. So this, again, it's far too coincidental. I'll just pull up the exact lines here so you can see what I'm talking about. So this is from the Shatapatha Brahmana, and we read about the Purusha. The gods heated him in the fire, and when the fire rose over him thus heated, that same vital air which had gone out from within him came back to him, and they put it into him, and the vigor which had gone out of him they put into him, and the food which had flowed from him they put into him. Having made him up entire and complete, they raised him so as to stand upright, and inasmuch as they raised him up, he is these worlds. He heats it on the fire, that is the sacrificer, even as the gods then heated him, that is Purusha Prajapati. And when the fire rises over it, thus heated, then that same vital air which went out from within him comes back to him, and he puts it into him. And when putting on the gold plate, he wears it. He puts into him that very vigor which had gone out of him. And when he puts on kindling sticks, he puts into him that very food which had flowed from him. These same ceremonies should be performed during a whole year, for that Prajapati Purusha, whence those substances went out, is the year. Into that whole Prajapati Purusha, he thus puts all that which belongs to him. Unquote. And that is the food and everything, those substances. And that is from Shatapatha Brahmana 7.1.2.6 through 10. And then we have, quote, "And he indeed is the ender, for it is he who by day and night reaches the end of the life of mortals, and then they die. Therefore he is the ender. And whosoever knows this year, death, the ender, the end of his life, that year does not reach, by day and night before old age, and he attains his full extent of life. The gods were afraid of this Prajapati, the year, death, the ender, lest he by day and night should reach the end of their life." Unquote. From Shatapatha Brahmana 10.4.3.2 through 3. We also read of the enclosing of the altar in this mythos. In the Shatapatha Brahmana, we read, "They enclose the altar and protect it on all sides." Cf. Shatapatha Brahmana 7.1.1.12, where the enclosing stones are said to represent the womb in which the embryo Agni is contained, etc. And then in 7.1.1.12, we read, "Garhapatya altar is the womb, and the sand is seed. He thus fills the whole womb with seed. He, the sacrificer, then encloses it with enclosing stones, for the enclosing stones are the womb. He thus encloses the seed here cast into the womb, and hence the seed which is cast is enclosed in the womb. And again, why he encloses it with enclosing stones. The Garhapatya hearth is this terrestrial world, and the enclosing stones are the waters, symbolically, of course. He thus surrounds this world with water. It is with the ocean that he thus surrounds it on all sides, and hence the ocean flows around this world on all sides." See, now as to the sacrifice, whatever food is placed on the fire, that is its food, and whatever water, that is its water. Its well-being is the enclosing stones, for they are of the nature of nights. Its light, the bricks, with special formulas, for they are the nature of days. And its immortal element, the fire, for that is the nature of the sun. Thus much as to the sacrifice." Unquote. And so we can see that these enclosing stones are important. They form the altar and they enclose the sacrifice. The Purusha is then placed in this sacrifice like a seed into a womb, symbolically speaking. It is then given food and drink. It is then given these sacrificial substances. It is a part of the process of the sacrifice. This directly mirrors what we have in the story of Hlahsar, which we can read in the Mabinogi here. We can see here that Matholwch is telling the story of his meeting with Hlahsar. And it reads, "So I took them with me and maintained them, and they were with me for a year." Very coincidental that he mentions this, a year, just like the Purusha. The sacrifice is said to take a year, and he is symbolically the year himself. So this year symbolism is intimately tied to this Purusha. "And that year I had them with me, not grudgingly, but thenceforth there was their murmuring, because that they were with me. For from the beginning of the 4th month they had begun to make themselves hated, and to be disorderly in the land, committing outrages and molesting and harassing the nobles and ladies. And thenceforward my people rose up and besought me to part with them, and they bade me to choose between them and my dominions." So this seems to be the equivalent of this sort of unrest toward the Purusha that develops in the Shatapatha Brahmana as well. They are the gods. The other gods are said to be fearful of the Purusha because he is death and the ender. And they are worried also about their own death and not having this immortality that they want to seek. "And I," that is Matholwch, "applied to the council of my country to know what should be done concerning them. For of their own free will they would not go, neither could they be compelled against their will." through fighting. And the people of the country being in this strait, they caused a chamber to be made all of iron. Now when the chamber was ready, there came there every smith that was in Ireland, and every one who owned tongs and hammer. And they caused coals to be piled up as high as the top of the chamber. And they had the man and the woman and the children served with plenty of meat and drink. But when it was known that they were drunk, they began to put fire to the coals about the chamber, and they blew it with bellows until the house was red hot all around them. Then was there a council held in the center of the floor of the chamber, and the man tarried until the plates of iron were all of a white heat. And then by reason of the great heat, the man dashed against the plates with his shoulder and struck them out. And his wife followed him. But except him and his wife, none escaped thence. And then I suppose, Lord, said Matholwch unto Bendigeid Vran, that he came over unto thee, that is, to Wales. Doubtless he came here, said he, and gave unto me the cauldron. In what manner didst thou receive him? Etc. And so it specifically says, from this he goes to Bran and directly gives him the cauldron. The sacred liquid is the result of this whole thing. So yes, Llásar causes unrest to the people in this symbolic year, and he is then put in an iron house where they heat him, and they give him food and drink just before they heat him. And finally, he bursts out, having survived this symbolic sacrifice, and from it, the sacred liquid emerges directly and is given and passed on down the line to the symbolic king, of course, Bran. Now, I would say this is obviously a symbolic symbolism. This is obviously a symbolic tableau scene. And I would challenge anyone to give a actually coherent explanation for this story that is actually clearer and more accounting for all the details and its position in the story than what I've said, equating it with the Vedic creation myth found in the Brahmanas, with the Purusha also being found in the Rig Veda in a more cryptic hymn, but it is still there nonetheless. And so yes, this Purusha sacrifice is what is happening in the Llásar story, the Welsh equivalent of the Purusha, of course. And that is why it is in this exact spot, happening right before the story of Branwen and Matholwch. And yes, it is impossible to explain this more fully and directly and simply and coherently than to see that it is in this direct parallel with the Purusha, with all of the same details, and explaining why it is this very cryptic and mystical sacrificial tableau, because that comes down from the Indo-European creation myth. And that is why all of the events in the story unfold in this order and with these details. Now, I have also shown elsewhere that Llásar is the equivalent of Lugith. Lugith is the grandson of Briochan by a different lineage, off to one side, you could say. And we have this son of Briochan named ITH, which I won't attempt to pronounce. And the son of this ITH is Lugith. So we have Lugith right there in the story of the sons of Briochan. He is there. He goes with the other sons of Briochan into Ireland and with the sons of Mil in order to take revenge. So Lugith is there. Lugith is there along with them, and he is the equivalent of this Llásar. But his sacrificial story is told in other traditions in Ireland, in other ways, as this Delvaith Lugith figure that keeps popping up elsewhere. So once we understand these points, we can look at all of the figures together. We have Eriu and her three sisters. Those are probable divine names, embodying Ireland is a sort of goddess role, and it has connections to the Mother Earth position. We then have Eivor Finn. We have Finn as this very clear, probable divine name connecting to other important myths and legends in the tradition. We then have his brother Eivor Down, also just called Down sometimes in the Book of Invasions itself. So he clearly has this divine name Down. We then have their father, Golov, who I've shown has this direct and specific equivalency to the name Manu, holding essentially the exact same semantic field of meanings of ardor and fury and this seething, overflowing heat. that becomes creative. And so that is also clearly a direct survival of a divine name because it is that specific. His father then is Bila, which is the word for the sacred tree. So that clearly can be and probably is a divine name. It is this God who is the sacred divine tree. His brother then is Mirhevnia. Mirhevnia is dark ocean. That clearly could be a divine name, a mythological name. Their father then, with we have these two perennial symbols of existence and non-existence known in many cultures, the dark ocean and the tree that is the cosmos blooming. And we have something above them. So we can see that they had a concept of something transcending the symbolic duality of existence and non-existence, and that just happens to be this figure who is the Lord of the tower slash pillar, being the Indo-European symbol of the absolute. So it just happens to be there, and his name does come from the root shared with the standard etymology of Brahman. The standard root etymology of Brahman shares this B superscript H, ERG superscript H, Proto-Indo-European etymology. And then we have Lugith, of course, who I mentioned, and he is another divine name used interchangeably with Lu. And so since these are all divine names, nobody can pretend they know this is not a coded myth. One of the things that people who disagree with what I'm saying say to me is that I need to be more cautious and careful. They are saying we have answered the question, is there a Celtic creation myth? Yet they haven't even gotten close to being thorough on that actual question. They are not being good faith in saying that they have done enough comparative mythology to answer this question. They are saying that they are able to answer the question of whether this is a creation myth without comparative mythology, or they are saying that they are able to answer the question of whether this is a creation myth by doing comparative mythology, but stopping it short without looking at everything, taking everything seriously. On the other hand, what I'm doing, of course, is looking at every piece of evidence, fully doing the puzzle, which involves multiple branches of mythology, seeing how they all align to form a consistent taxonomy, which then can be applied and looked at in a much closer and more detailed way to the Celtic material to actually honestly and thoroughly answer this question. That is how you be careful and cautious on an important question like this. You actually thoroughly look at it. You actually go through all of the details that are possible to look at. There are many details that these people have not looked at or even refuse to look at. That is not being careful. That is the opposite of being careful or cautious on this question. Instead, it is being very arrogant and reckless. It should be clear that the most incautious thing you could do when asking, how do I taxonomize, how do I classify an instance of a new thing, the most incautious thing you could do would be to not compare it to other categories and to not be thorough when doing so. That would be the height of being uncareful on this question. So ultimately, these people overextend themselves by saying that they can answer whether or not there is a Celtic creation myth when they are not in a position to actually say yes or no on that question. You can generally tell what they are doing in that regard with how hastily they attempt to ignore or push aside any possible evidence toward an identification of a Celtic creation myth. On the issue of creation myths specifically, every other society essentially that we look at has creation myths. Therefore, it is not at all the null hypothesis that in the giant body of Celtic literature that none of these could be creation myths if we looked at them correctly. It is not at all the null hypothesis that the Celts have no creation myth. That actually has to be supported by positive evidence. To say then that you have proven that there is none would take extraordinary steps. Now, it is also a bit of disingenuous deflection to tell someone, be careful, be cautious with your work, because everyone needs to be cautious all the time with their work. It goes without saying. So this is just sort of a way to deflect from one's own need to take caution and the things that they are not taking the responsibility to give evidence for, etc. So as we can see, the people who want to say that there is no creation myth are simply unaware of the jewel that they are holding. And so what they end up doing is kicking dust over the jewel. Now, ultimately, we live in an ocean of dust. We live in an ocean of dust. So this doesn't matter that much. But it is more about the fact that a person who kicks dust over a jewel like this is inflicting on themselves a strange sort of curse, a strange sort of petty curse, because it is a small sin or crime, you might say, to not do the due diligence well enough on an issue like this, and to thus end up kicking dust over a precious jewel like this. It is a small sort of crime, and so many scholars do this that it makes no difference one scholar doing it or another doing it. But in the long run, you are signing your name to this process of covering this jewel with dust, and you don't have to be doing that. You don't have to be inflicting that upon yourself, and that is what can be changed ultimately. And that is what I find interesting to try to change directly to people, is that in the end, over time, this jewel will remain there and will come through and become clear when people actually take time to be thorough on this topic rather than being superficial as they have been. But in the meantime, individual people can choose to simply not kick sand on this precious jewel and instead be part of the effort to bring it to light sooner rather than later.